Luke Hemingway, the author of the Wolf Lake series, hopes that you enjoy the final installment of Wolf Lake from the perspective of James. There's going to be one more episode of the crossover after this from Braun's perspective, but as far as the ranger from Wolf Lake goes, this is the end. He would like to thank each and every person who's followed the series up to the conclusion, and hopes that you enjoy this epic finale. He would like to thank Mr. Mills for contributing to the writing of this episode to make sure that it's as good as it can be. So strap in and prepare for the finale. Nightfall washed down the Rocky Mountains, draining down over the trees and the rocks, and settled on the roof of the base camp. The only thing fighting the darkness off was the floodlights spread throughout the tents. We all converged under the main tent and we were given our briefing. Okay, here's how it is, people. The spiders have finished their feedings and they are at full maturity. Death count is expected to be around 17,000, and that's just what we confirmed. They've taken out Wolf Lake, the surrounding towns, and the entire south of Denver. The rest of the country has gone into lockdown, under the guise of a foreign nuclear threat alert. All public communications have been shut down to avoid more exposure. The commanding officer explained. His tone was one of a man who was used to giving such briefings to his men, ahead of large-scale, high-stakes operations, but his confidence was blunted each time that he gazed around the table at us, catching glimpses of Braun and his gang. The bulk of the spiders have already gathered in the mountains and begun to build the nest. The satellite radiation feed tells us that. The rest are slowly filtering in from the other feeding sites. He added. I looked across at Braun, subtly clenching his left claw. I wasn't sure if this was just something he did when he heard about innocents dying, or it was how coldly the agency had worded such things. Images show that they're building what looks like to be a giant cocoon. Soon they will all be inside and the ritual will begin. This is when we go in, when they are vulnerable. The commander concluded with an intense stare. He shared among the group. Phil put an unsure hand up like an awkward school kid. The soldier pointed at him, gesturing for him to speak. Question. Why don't we just drop a nuke on the nest? Take them all out while they're doing, whatever it is that they're doing in there. The commander gave a hesitant look before a defeated nod of his head. Believe me, sir, that was plan A. Lives will be lost out there, and I don't want to risk any of our lives if I don't have to, but I don't know what kind of powers these things have. But anytime we try to lock on a missile, the system becomes scrambled and encrypted. I mean, we could fire it in blind, of course, but given how we are all in close proximity, and we have no guarantee of a direct hit, it's been vetoed. Now, we need all boots on the ground to get in there and plant 4 devices, containing enough C4 each to wipe out a small army on each side of the nest, he asserted. And whose job is that? Bob Farrar asked curiously. Now don't worry, none of us have explosives training. We have a dedicated team of 4 trained operatives who will plant the bombs, and 2 backup teams, should they become injured or killed. The commander explained coldly. Wow, you plan for everything, I said with a sarcastic edge to my tone. The commander picked up on it but chose to ignore it. Yes, we have. Battle plan soldiers will lead the group. Those with explosives and communications will be in center pack, receiving the most cover and protection. Non-soldiers will bring up the rear for support. Non-human friendlies will flank the group and sniff out potential threats. We need to take out any hostiles preventing us from safely planting those explosives. Once we have achieved that, we get to a safe distance and detonate, the commander instructed. He was no nonsense and glared at us, sniffing out weakness and apprehension. After a brief glance around the table, he nodded with satisfaction. Now, to give a better understanding of what you're about to face, Dr. Patrick Wallace would like to speak to you, the commander informed us, gesturing for a man to take his place at the head of the table. He was a small, geeky-looking man. I recognized him instantly as the scientist from the videos at the bunker. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I truly wish that we were all meeting under more positive circumstances, but here we are." I have been following the work of the cult rebels known as the Black-Robed People for some time now, ever since some religious books were uncovered from a number of abandoned churches a few years back. Now I know a few of you were present when our existence was threatened by the five-headed witch. Now, having gone through the passages of these ancient books, this is the situation," he said, taking a breath, readying himself to deliver his speech. "Now, the spiders have been multiplying by cocooning victims and planting seeds. They have also been increasing in size due to feeding. They now have enough numbers and maturity to complete the final ritual. The spiders will all gather in the nest and the priest will perform the final sermon. The spiders will essentially form into one entity in a type of symbiotic mating ritual. Once that is complete, the man at the center of all this will be reborn into this world in a form that we cannot stop. Edward Dean Keller, a callous and psychopathic individual who tore children from their beds and did unspeakable things with them, right up until his death in 2003. But I assure you people, the things that come out of that cocoon, it'll be a horror like on this world or any other has ever seen." The intense weight of his words hung in the air for a few seconds. No one said a word. Everybody just shared uncomfortable glances. I looked over at Braun and I found it astounding how human his personality could be despite his monstrous appearance. He had a tell when he was angry, his left claw tensed, and right now it was clenching again. "He said there were others who have taken innocent human lives," Braun said with a resentful snarl that visibly intimidated Dr. Wallace. Yeah, that is correct, Mr. The doctor was stuttering, so I came to the rescue. "Braun. His name is Braun," I stated with cheery confidence. Braun turned to me, bowing his head appreciatively. "Okay, yeah, Braun, you are correct. The ritual will be guarded by 4 other entities. Now I've researched these fiends with some thoroughness. They are extremely dangerous in their current form, but they are able to be killed, or subdued at the very least. Here's what I've managed to pull together." The doctor laid out some laminated photocopies of the ancient books that I had seen before, each of them depicting the cartoonish ash drawings of these so-called others. First up is the dentist, a highly insidious and malignant warrior with an arachnid humanoid form, carrying a malevolent mix of claws and clamps that will slice through armed men like a hot knife through butter. A creature with an overwhelming interest for human enamel. So I really hope that you brought your gum shields. While there are no specific keys to defeating this creature, if you can get close, then you have a chance of killing it. But I can't stress this enough. It will not make it easy at all. It's extremely agile and evasive. It'll be on you before you even have a chance to reload your weapon," he explained, his fingertip resting on the first image. He slid over to the second. The chameleon, a shape-shifting horror. In its true form, it doesn't have the fighting capabilities as the others. However, this thing has the ability to take the form of any living thing that it touches, with the added abilities to alter the size of the object. For example, it could take the form of a wasp and make it the size of a bear. The key to defeating this creature is to attack it in its original form. His finger slid ominously to the next image. The Whistler, the Pied Piper of the group, small, compact, not much to look at all, but the unique ability to put an entire army under its spell by simply whistling a tune. It can turn the best of friends against the other, manipulate parents to go after their own children, and don't let its appearance fool you. It loves to feed and it's exceptionally aggressive. Key to victory is to block out its tune, which is why all soldiers have been fitted with a noise-canceling feature to prevent you being affected. His finger slid for the final time to the fourth image. Last but not least, the flayer. Much like the dentist, it is one of, if not the most skilled fighter of the group. Savage, ruthless, and callous, as well as possessing ungodly strength, speed, and power. It has the ability to skin any living thing alive and disguise itself as the victim, mimicking their voice, memories, and personality. This creature can only die by its own hand. No mortal weapon can harm it. The doctor laid one more image on the table, the cartoonish image of a giant spider-like creature with a sinister smile, so wide that it looked painful. And this is what they are protecting. This is the leader, the Smiler, aka Ed Keller, the only human deemed sick and twisted enough by the underworld to be worthy of this unholy reincarnation. This creature has been feared by every age, every religion, and every civilization over the course of thousands of years. It's not only that he has no keys to his defeat, but it will grant immortality to all those who serve it. We must stop this ritual and prevent its birth. But the others will protect the ritual at all costs, because once the ritual is complete in Keller or in this context, the Smiler is born. They will all be unstoppable, and these 5 horsemen of the apocalypse will then wreak a savage plague of pain, suffering, and death across our planet. The doctor's remarks made everyone's hearts fall into their stomachs, as the implications of what he was saying truly hit home. So, what you're saying is that if this thing hatches, this ultimate cryptid, well, it's over. There's no way of stopping it, like at all. Phil asked, a frustrated bewilderment to his tone. No, if the mission fails, then we drop a bomb on this place big enough to wipe out the surrounding 7 states. We die along with many others, but the world lives another day. Miles posits with authority. It will not come to that. I will make sure of it. Braun snapped, slamming his claw down on the table, sending everything on it ricocheting into the air, along with a crack that ran up the length of the middle, threatening to split the table in half. Dr. Wallace looked like he had been electrocuted and not knowing where to put himself. I took it that he didn't have many anthropology lessons to government-created monsters on a regular basis. I'm sorry, Mr. Black, but actually, that won't be an option, he whimpered sheepishly, causing Braun's and everyone else's demeanor to shift completely. Everyone just looked at the doctor with confusion. What on earth are you talking about? The commander snapped with anger, demanding an answer. A nuclear purge of the area, it won't work. Even if there is anyone left alive to push the launch button, it won't matter because, how can I put this? The doctor said tentatively. He inhaled deeply before he spoke. What will come out of that nest? It won't be a cryptid or an alien, a monster or a demon. It'll be a god. Immortal. Nothing or no weapon can kill it in that form. The Smiler would then grant this ability to the others too. And we would have 5 malignant and malevolent immortals who would destroy this world. We either win or we lose. It's that simple. The weight of his statement began to crush what little confidence that everyone had. Why would those black-robed whack jobs raise something that would just destroy the earth? It makes no sense, Farrar remarked with scoff. I think they were angry about Yule. I don't think they knew what they were getting themselves into, if I'm honest. I muttered to myself out loud in a daze. The room went quiet and I looked up, a little embarrassed as if catching myself from saying any more. I noticed the doctor was looking at me with some curiosity. Braun broke the silence with a deep sigh before addressing the doctor. What about severing the anchor to the real world, like with the 5-footed witch? Braun asked with reluctant curiosity. The doctor hung his head in a somber fashion, suggesting that he knew all about the relationship between Dr. John and Braun. It is potentially an option, yes. Prior to the confrontation with the 5-footed witch, the religious text gave information about the beast, but upon examining them after the fact, there were sections from the books removed, entire pages torn out. It's safe to assume that these pages would have alluded to the key of defeating the creature. And when I was examining the pages when it came to our current problem, well, more pages were missing. It is clear that there is a way to defeat the Smiler, but it is likely one of great sacrifice too. The issue is, when it came to the witch, Dr. John's daughter was used in the ritual, so the tie was rather obvious. But in this case, Keller has no surviving kin, nor does Yubel. So if this is the way to defeat it, the anchored method isn't so obvious to us right now, and time is against us. The doctor explained tentatively, careful not to offend the cryptid who stood a matter of meters from him. I looked over at Braun. He looked deep in thought. I think anyway. It was hard to tell. But he certainly had the same look in his face that he did in my cabin earlier, when we were swapping stories of loved ones taking their lives. It was like every happy memory he and his friend had shared, it was racing through his mind. James, all those dreams you had of Keller, had you ever seen anything? Anything that we could use if the worst comes to the worst? Phil's question came out of the blue, putting me on the spot, and it caught me off guard. I took a second to think about my answer. No. They were mainly just to show me what he did to the victims, when he was alive and when he was dead too. I murmured, hanging my head in disgust, as the images replayed in my mind. What about the one you had before we set off to Jenny's farm? Phil probed, causing the group to turn to me with intense curiosity. Before I answered, I caught a glimpse of Dr. Wallace once again. There was something about his expression that told me he was the most interested in my response. Like I said back at Wolf Lake, I saw when he was arrested. I heard you, Bob. I responded, gesturing at the sheriff, who looked bemused. Me? Yeah. I watched when you rolled up to the meat factory. I heard you asking him to come out. I saw when he escaped through the trap door. Farrar remarked presumptuously. I nodded. And then I saw when he ran into the cult, and how they offered him a death that would mean anyone who touched the soil of Wolf Lake Forest would essentially be his prey. They promised him that he could carry on his evil depravity for years, until the day came when they would finally unearth him, and he would unleash a terrible vengeance on this world. He didn't need much convincing. They told him to leap from God and give himself to the devil. I felt like it was a strange phrase at the time, but to be honest, after that I saw the ritual where they used Yubel's corpse to give Keller an outlet into the world. The group remained silent, hanging on my every word. Show them. A soft, encouraging growl came from the group. I looked up. Braun was gesturing for me to roll up my sleeve. The entire group began altering their confused stares between us. I sighed and pulled up my sleeve. The group gasped with shock and disbelief as I revealed the horrific wounds on my arm that resembled scars left by sharp claws. What the heck? When did that happen? Phil yelled. Some of the soldiers began to tentatively raise their guns, aiming them at Braun. It happened in my dream. It was Keller. I answered, quickly diffusing any trigger-happy soldiers jumping to the wrong conclusion. Everybody looked on in confused shock, whereas Dr. Wallace seemed to be deep in thought. I've had a lot of dreams about Keller. I've been pinned down, grabbed, you name it, but this is a first, I remarked, examining my wound. The group was silent for a moment, but with Dr. Wallace seemingly just about to ask a question, a noise broke the tension, a radio crackling to life. It was the commander's. Green light, I repeat, green light, over. The voice crackled through the static. The commander listened to the message and quickly turned his attention to the group. The last of the spiders have reached the ritual site. We need to saddle up and move out now, the commander yelled. A few of the other soldiers began quickly ushering me, Phil, Farrar, and Jenny to another tent, where we could receive weapons. Miles, Nick, and Richard went to another, likely to conduct agency business. Braun, Arya, and the orchestrator meanwhile conversed by the main tent. As I walked over to the armory, I noticed that there seemed to be some more tense words between Braun and the orchestrator. I tried to listen in on the discussion, but something distracted me. Dr. Wallace's hand grabbed my shoulder. I turned to him, startled by his sudden appearance. "Sorry, Mr. Parker, but may I have a word, please? In private?" he asked tentatively. Yeah, sure," I replied cautiously, keeping one eye on the tense argument brewing between Braun and the orchestrator. The doctor led me around the back of an unused tent. "So, what did you need to speak to me about?" I asked curiously. "It's about the vision you had." "What about it?" "Well, this vision was after Keller was given a vessel to enter our world in a more physical capacity. You said he attacked you in a dream, and that's how you got that?" he asked, gesturing towards my arm. I instinctively pulled up my sleeve and examined the wound. Yeah, for the initial part of the vision, it was like I was watching a show. The characters paid me no notice, it was like I wasn't there. I didn't understand why I needed to see what I was seeing. But then he just appeared, and it was clear that he could see me. He came for me. "Keller did it, yes?" Wallace asked, assertively seeking confirmation. I nodded. "And what happened when he appeared?" "Well, he grabbed me, as you can see, and tried to pull me into this loose earth where he came from. All the other dreams when he made contact with me, I would wake up, feeling scared and vulnerable. Sometimes I had so much fear that he reached out in this world to get me, but this one was different. It was like he was trying to take me into his world," I speculated, staring at the floor. I looked up to see Dr. Wallace with an anxious look on his face. "What?" "When I read the books, there were sections that were torn out, just like with the witch. However, there were some words that remained, along with half of some words where the paper had been torn. I managed to piece together what I could, and the partial transcription essentially said that with any evil force brought into the world by the devil and his advocates, the power of God and his will would balance things out, giving someone the chance to advocate him on earth. And well, the rest of the inscription was indecipherable. But I'm thinking that there was something significant about your vision. This was the other forces giving you the tools to beat Keller. And I think Keller knew that, so he tried to take you out of this world where you could hurt him, and take you into his world where he could hurt you." His explanation was a lot to take in. "And you think God is giving me the chance to advocate him?" I asked with a bewildered chuckle. "I'm not even religious." "No, but I've read your file, and your family were. Your parents were both devout Christians. Your brother ended himself with a 9mm. The police file said they found an open Bible next to his body. Psalm 23, verses 1 through 6. You stopped going to church the minute your brother had killed himself, and the mention of God made you think of your brother, so you distanced yourself from your faith. But when you came to Wolf Lake, Keller had sensed your pain, and he found you almost instantly, tormented you, targeted you, and he tried to kill you on several occasions. Now, was this because you were an easy target, or because he knew his fate laid in your hands? All these visions and dreams over the past year, you could have seen what his weakness is. I would bet my bottom dollar that whatever it was in that last vision." The doctor said, grabbing my jacket collar and shaking me with urgency, as if trying to jumpstart my memory. "But I didn't see anything. I don't know what this thing is," I snapped at him, unable to deal with the pressure that he was piling on me. "Well, it could have been something you heard, anything, think. Please, all of our lives depend on it," the doctor ranted. I felt my heart begin to pound as the pressure continued to mount. "Parker, James, please report to the armory," a stern voice commanded from within the camp. "I have to go," I murmured to the doctor, who still had a tight grip on the scruffs of my coat. I walked away from him, forcing him to let go as he fell to his knees. I stared back in horror, observing the fear of what was coming, what was manifesting in this man. "James, please, you have the key. You just need to find it." His sobs grew fainter as I left him in the dark. I made my way over to the armory. As I turned the corner, Miles stood there, so close to the edge that we almost collided. I looked up at him, startled by his sudden presence. "What are you doing? We need to get ready, come on," he yelled. The impact of what the doctor had told me is still taking over my mind. I was mute. I simply nodded and followed him to the armory. I was handed an automatic weapon kitted up with body armor and given a tactical helmet. A soldier gave me a quick crash course on how to hold the weapon, safety features, and a reloading tutorial. I was then pointed in the direction of the group, who were getting ready to set off into the mountains. I joined the back of the group, locating Phil. I approached him from behind, lining myself beside him. "Where'd you go, son? I was looking for you," he asked in a hushed voice, the nerves of the up-and-coming battle clearly subduing his usual cheery confidence. "I was, just saying a prayer," I muttered, thinking of a lie, not wanting more questions or pressure. Phil gave me a confused look, knowing that I wasn't religious like my parents, but just assumed that it was the fear talking and he left it be. "Listen, son, I know that we ain't known each other all that long, but we have been through it all this last year. I truly see you as like one of my own, and so when we get into those mountains and it starts to hit the fan, I want you to know that I would give my life for yours." He slapped my shoulder and gripped it tight. The look in his eyes told me that he meant every word. I smiled at Phil. It was highly likely this would be the last moment that we ever had together. "I love you, Phil. Thanks for everything that you've done for me, and I would give my life for you too," I responded congruently. Phil had a tear in his eye, half from emotion, half from apprehension and fear, too most likely. Another word didn't get said, and it didn't need to. The only words that came next were from the front of the group. The commander was stood at the edge of the trail that led into the trees, elevating himself by perching on a pile of storage boxes. He looked out in the large group of misfits, the last shield against the mercy of the underworld. "Okay, everyone, prepare to move out on my command," the officer spoke confidently into his megaphone. We all turned to face him. "But before we head off to face the unknown, I want you to remember something. What is coming up in those mountains, it is a must-win situation. Defeat means that the world as we know it and the people who live in it with us cease to exist. Now, if you look around, I'm sure you'll see people who you like and trust, and some of who you do not." Everybody turned their heads, looking at their good friends before turning them again and looking at their enemies. Phil to my right, Miles to my left. I watched Braun in the trees. He had a good mix of people looking at him with disdain, but we caught each other's eyes for a second and gave each other a nodding gesture of respect. I looked away, only to see the orchestrator looking at Braun. I couldn't help wonder if he was looking at a friend or an enemy. "But none of the past matters anymore," the commander yelled, his tone becoming more and more passionate with each passing sentence. "All that matters is the future of this planet as we know it." His tone more serious and subtle now. "Those of you who die will not be mourned. Those of you who live will not be celebrated. But without knowing it, every single living and breathing person will be in your debt." His tone now sincere and appreciative. "Because every time you walk down a street and feel the breeze in your face, every time you feel the warm embrace of a loved one, every time you watch your child take its first step or say its first word, you will know." His voice was now passionate and reaching a crescendo. "You'll know that it was possible because of this night on this mountain. We showed the ones who call this world their home that we'll not go quietly into the night. We will not lay down and let the darkness wash us away. and we won't give up our lives without a fight. Evil will know that when it came knocking. We answered the door and told it, not today, and not any day soon. The crowd roared with fierce motivation, ready to go out on their shields in the name of one more day of humanity. On me, the commander yelled, jumping off his podium, spearheading the formation and leading us into the woods. Me and Phil shared one last look of apprehension and anxiety before falling in line and heading into the forest. Only the light from the moon, the flashlights, and the white of everyone's eyes were what fought back the darkness in those woods. It was the darkest that I had ever seen at night. Not a star in the sky. It was like they knew what was coming and they sought cover. The passion from the commander's speech carried over into the march for all of 30 yards, before fear and dread quickly set in. Each footstep was careful and deliberate now. Everyone rotated their weapons 180 degrees as they walked, lighting up the darkness with the mounted flashlights, looking for any sign of movement or threat. Braun climbed up each tree, crawling along the branches, smelling the air, before moving along. Meanwhile, Arya darted in between the trunks of the trees, scouting our flank. Her speed was terrifying. If you were her prey, you'd be dead before you even knew that she was coming for you. Meanwhile, the orchestrator hung back, observing the scene in front of him. It was hard to tell if he was watching our backs, or if he just wasn't interested in being the first to die. Jenny kept up with Braun, aiming her weapon into the trees, watching his rear. As the group continued forward, me and Phil came in line with Braun, as he perched on the base of a branch, scouting the surroundings. "Hey," I hissed. He turned to look at me. "Anything?" I asked anxiously. "Not a single scent. I don't understand. I should have one by now. Either they are miles away or these creatures don't leave a scent," Braun remarked, a frustrated yet concerned growl bubbling up in his throat. Hearing this, I pushed forward through the group, catching up to Nick and Miles. Nick was a part of the communications team. He carried a device that showed a map of the radiation output in our area. This was how they had tracked down the five-headed witch by all accounts, and it was how they were keeping tabs on Keller and his crew. I just spoke to Braun. He says that he can't find a scent. Maybe we should, scan the area, or however that thing works. I advised him frantically. "Yeah, not surprised. I checked 5 minutes ago. All clear up ahead," Nick assured me. "Look, just check again." Braun was bred for tracking these things, and I could sense it in his voice. "Something isn't right," I argued back. Nick looked at Miles for approval, which he got in the form of a single nod. He pulled up the radar on the screen and began scanning for radiation. Me, Miles, and now Phil too, who evidently didn't fancy walking alone, gathered around Nick and the tablet device. Nick began looking puzzled as the screen started malfunctioning and distorting. "I don't understand. It was working just a minute ago." "Hold up." Miles called up to the front of the group, halting everyone in their tracks. "Black, what's the problem?" the commander yelled. "Communication malfunction, sir. We're walking in blind." Miles responds with authority. "Could be the trees and hills blocking the signal. There's higher ground up ahead," the commander yelled, gesturing for his 6 soldiers to lead Nick further up the trail. Meanwhile, the group took 5 and made sure the weapons were fully loaded and no equipment was damaged. "Maybe one of the cryptids should go with," a soldier suggested to the commander. "Good idea, Private," the commander replied. The private turned to eye Braun in the trees, whistling at him like he was some sort of cadaver dog. Braun's bright yellow eyes narrowed as his contempt rose to the surface. The commander slapped the private's arm down as he whistled. "Not you, Red. We may need you. Hey, lizard boy," the commander barked, aiming his call to the back of the group, where the orchestrator looked down a little disinterested, but now clearly aggravated. "Time to pull your weight, pal." the commander remarked, waving him over. The orchestrator hissed dismissively, folding his arms in protest of the command. We all watched as Braun jumped down from the tree. The thud of his feet landed on the earth and grabbed the attention of the reptilian creature. No words were said. Braun simply gestured for him to follow the order by pointing up the hill. He muttered under his breath as it stormed over to Nick and the 6 waiting soldiers. They jogged up the hill with the sulking reptile in behind, turned the corner and disappeared from sight. "Hey, Braun," I whispered over to him. He turned to give me his attention. "What's the deal with him? The orchestrator, I mean. Are you like friends or?" I asked with genuine curiosity. Braun sighed. "It's a complex situation." "Yeah, no crap," Phil remarked, facetiously, chuckling nervously. Braun was moments from elaborating on his and the lizard's relationship, but no words had the chance to leave his mouth. For what came next was a blood-curdling scream from up the hill. More accurately, 6 blood-curdling screams. The group spanned to attention the staggered sound of weapons being cocked, as the flashlight beams all converged into one large beam in the direction of the screams. The screams started off as terror, like they had seen the most horrifying thing that you could possibly imagine, and then they all turned to pain, slowly increasing in intensity until their agony had them squealing so hard it sounded like they were giggling. The screams ended and all that remained were faint and desperate pleading sobs coming from the woods. Before silence. Nothing but putrid and deafening silence. It was so quiet that you could hear everyone's hearts pounding against their sternums. The ragged breathing of everyone overlapping, as the condensation from the rapid exhales created a terrifying mist lit up by the beams of the flashlights. We all readied ourselves, waiting for something to happen. We stood as one, hyper-vigilant, ready to unleash what weapons we carried, all at a moment's notice. Suddenly, a sound came from the woodland to our right. The lights and guns all span in unison to face the sound. The bushes rustled and twigs began to snap. We all tensed our trigger fingers, narrowed our eyes, and aimed at the noise. Nick came falling out of the bushes holding his arms up, begging us not to shoot. He was pale, covered in blood spatter, and was crying so hard that no sound was leaving his mouth. "Lower your weapons," the commander yelled, holding up the back of his palm to the group. Miles ran over to his traumatized friend, as the scream that was trapped in his throat finally left his mouth. "They're all dead. It slaughtered them, tore them to pieces, right in front of my eyes," he exclaimed, sobbing as Miles ushered him into the safety of the group. "What happened, Nick?" Miles asked with concern, as we all crowded around to listen. "I climbed up some rocks to get a signal on the radar, and something came out of the woods and killed them," he muttered, still visibly shaken. "Killed them?" one breathless voice asked. "Came out of the woods?" Another asked as a few others began waving their weapons and lights into the surrounding trees. "Yeah, just cut through them, I mean. It destroyed them. Even the lizard guy, just completely wiped him out," Nick gasped. I noticed that Braun had lined up beside me. He leaned down to Nick. "It killed the orchestrator?" Braun asked, a hint of suspicion in his voice. Nick looked up at him, looking side to side as nervous about the question. "Yeah, it took him out first and then turned on the soldiers," Nick responded, more sobs coming to the surface. "No one got a single round off?" the commander asked, puzzled. Nick just shook his head. "Right, people, we are in hostile territory now. Fingers on triggers. We don't have the luxury of turning back, so let's get a move," the commander yelled, leading the group now up the hill. Miles helped Nick to his feet and they joined the group. Me and Phil followed suit, and Braun stayed with us. I turned to look at his concerned face. "Why aren't you in the trees?" I asked, puzzled. "Mourning your friend?" Phil ventured. Braun turned to look at us. We are far from friends, but I will say, the orchestrator is a powerful beast. It ruled over a dimension known as the Annihilation Realm. Nearly defeated me in combat. He wouldn't have died so easily. Not to mention the agents not firing a single bullet, Braun remarked. So what are you saying, big guy? Phil probed. I'm saying I don't like the way that Nick smells either, Braun grunted. The way he smells? I asked as we rounded the corner and trekked up the hill. It doesn't smell like most humans. His scent, it's got a hint of rot. Well, he's covered in blood, to be fair. Phil quipped and I nodded in agreement. Braun shook his head just as the holy craps and oh my god began to whimper from various members of the group. The outlines of 5 bodies came visible as we approached. They were hanging from the trees by their necks. And as we got closer, we didn't see clothing or any features. We just saw blood, tissue, and tendons. They had all been skinned. No, something isn't right, Braun speculated, as he began to look around frantically for Arya and Jenny. As the group approached the hanging bodies, the torch beams from the lights lit up the grisly sight. Fresh blood was still dripping from the bodies' feet as they swung in the gentle night breeze. Any sign of the lizard? The commander yelled. Nothing but declines came back at him. Arya and Jenny approached Braun after he had managed to locate and grab their attention. Get ready, Braun instructed us. The female Wendigo got low to the ground, coiling her body like a cat ready to pounce, grinding her antlers on the ground as if trying to sharpen them that little bit more. Jenny readied her weapon and lifted the gun to her shoulder through steady breaths. Me and Phil picked up on the trio's anxiety and quickly followed suit. The group gathered around the 5 corpses as they all hung from various branches suspended by a rope that looked like it was over 100 years old. They were spread around the mini clearing, like morbid Christmas tree decorations, placed in such a manner for one reason: to instill fear and panic. Whatever did this may as well have put up a big sign that said, "Come any further and you will all die." Where's the orchestrator? Jenny gasped at Braun. Braun lifted his nose to the air and inhaled deeply. I don't know, but I can't smell this dead flesh. If they did kill him, they took him far away. It's not possible. Braun remarked, once again becoming visibly more concerned. Meanwhile, the few of the soldiers that were brave enough to step into the tree line carefully examined the surrounding area. Braun, what do you mean? Do you think that there's something else at play? I asked as a bit of commotion began brewing in the tree line. A few more soldiers ran over to assist. Nick, he smells dead. But even though he is covered in blood, I should be able to smell this living flesh too, Braun explained. Me and Phil shared a grave and concerned glare at one another, when suddenly a voice came from the trees. Commander, we got another body over here, a soldier yelled with panicked urgency. Nick Miles, along with everybody else, looked over in confusion. Is it the lizard? The commander yelled. Negative, human, the voice responded. Me, Phil, Jenny, Braun, and Arya all looked at one another as the penny dropped like a bomb. Braun opened his claws, coiling back his talons and leapt towards Miles and Nick. He was just about to make contact when Nick's head snapped to the side to make eye contact with Braun midair. He pulled his fist back and threw it forward at a near supersonic speed, sending Braun soaring like he was just hit by a car. Braun went flying completely out of our line of sight, and we all turned to face Nick. Miles and the rest of the crowd cautiously but very quickly backing away from him. Nick began to grin, a sick, evil, twisted grin that made all of our blood run cold. And then he started to laugh, maniacally. His usual tone grew deeper and more hoarse by the second, until the laughter didn't even sound like it was coming from a human. It was his hand that first began to mutate, his skin bulging as an assortment of sharp weapons exploded from underneath his fingers. 2 knives, a razor, and a sickle for fingers, along with a hook for a thumb, protruded from a muscular arm that revealed itself as Nick's skin split from the pressure. As his face began to contort and deform, 2 antlers burst from his cranium as the rest of his face tore in two. His thighs ripped open and his torso separated as the creature underneath shrugged off the now dead fleshy rags. And just like that, we came face to face with the Flayer. A bipedal hulking beast, a titanous, hammer-like fist on the right, and its giant Swiss Army knife on the other. Both hands were attached to the arms and torso of a male bodybuilder, along with the head of a deranged, psychotic deer, all sat on the back legs of a goat. Its hands were clearly its weapons of torture. We all stared at the rusted, gritty blades painted with both dry and fresh blood in utter horror. The creature scanned its surroundings. Its eyes burned red before it leapt into action. "Crap! Crap!" I yelled in panic, jumping back with my gun as the Flayer leaps forward and grabs the first soldier in his line of sight, cutting off his gunfire prematurely. The man screamed as this horrifying monstrosity quite literally tore him limb from limb, his arms being pulled off like tender meat from a bone. More gunfire erupts as the Flayer doesn't even flinch, as he throws the soldier's body to the side, before anyone had a chance to get distance between themselves and the creature. It lunged for another soldier as the rainfall of bullets did little to stop it, simply creating holes in the beast that didn't bleed, but healed in a matter of seconds. The creature leapt through the air majestically, landing like a graceful tornado, blades out and hitting the nearest soldier like a blender. The creature stepped back, letting the breeze finish off the already dead soldier. We all watched as his still standing form collapsed like a tower of diced beef. The Flayer observed more and more bullets, holes of old and rotten flesh popping all over his back. He turned to a group of 3 soldiers, springing off the ground and whirling in midair as his wound sealed shut. The Flayer landed behind the soldiers before they even had a chance to turn. Blades exploded through one of the men's eyes before another's head was severed with one clean swipe. The remaining soldier turned to fire, but the Flayer was too quick. Scary quick. Crouching down and spinning, it severed the man's knee ligaments, his legs falling apart, unable to support the weight of his thighs and upper body. His thigh bones burst through the skin of his knees as he squealed in agony. The Flayer leapt into the air, landing with an elegant firmness, driving the blades into the soldier's heart. It pulled away from its handiwork, tearing the still throbbing organ from the man's chest. It covered the heart with his mouth, peeling it from the blade with its blunt teeth as they screeched against the rusty steel. As the creature swallowed the meat with a look of frenzied satisfaction on its twisted face, one soldier, having just seen his friends and teammates destroyed, ran at the beast with a passionate roar, firing his weapon as he charged at the monster. The Flayer's head snapped to the side, its glare halting the man in his tracks as he literally peed his pants, right there and then. The Flayer didn't halt though. He slashed and gashed, whipping its blades all over the man's clothing and flesh, like the orchestrator of a symphony. And that's when I realized that this wasn't being done out of rage. This was art to this thing. The man didn't scream, he didn't flinch. He just stood as the creature ripped and teared him apart. The Flayer stood back. The soldier's reinforced helmet fell to bits like a block of Legos, before the Flayer grabbed a fistful of his hair, and with one pull, yanked his skin clean off, like the mask of a Scooby-Doo villain. The soldier was now just muscles and tendon, and he realized what was happening, and let out a blood-curdling scream of shock and agony. The Flayer leapt back with a backswing of his blades, taking out the skinless man. Everyone watched on in horror. This thing was going to kill us all, and enjoy every second of it. The Flayer looked around the group as if singing Eeny Meeny Miny Mo to itself. We all recoiled when it fixed its sights on Jenny. Jenny began frantically trying to load her hunting rifle as the flare leapt towards her. But just before it had reached her, Arya had pounced on the beast, for the first time causing this thing to lose its balance and fall to the ground. It snarled as Arya clamped down on its weapon-laced arm. She began to violently throw her skull from side to side, dragging the beast around the ground as it roared out in a combination of rage and pain. This is when we all started to believe that we had a hope of beating it. "Everyone, fire now! Help the Wendigo!" The commander shouted as everybody adjusted to get an angle where they could shoot the beast, but also avoid hitting Arya. But after several seconds of thrashing, the flare was able to get to its feet, reach over and grab Arya by the snout with its bulky hand, clamping down on her jaws and violently throwing her over its shoulder, sending Arya flying across the clearing and smashing clean through a tree trunk, causing the large oak to fall to the side and hit the ground with an explosive thud. The flare, now back on its feet, was ready to take more victims. We all backed up, ready for what seemed like our inevitable doom as it leapt across the clearing towards a group of soldiers. The beast throws out his left arm, corkscrewing in midair, slicing 3 of the soldiers clean in half. The flare turned to another who stood frozen in terror. No blades this time. It cocked its hammer fist back and drove it straight into the soldier's face. The sound of skull membrane cracking like an egg rang out through the forest. The head of the soldier fell apart like a burst watermelon and his body went limp. The flare this time turned to face me, but I couldn't move. With a moment of empathy for the others who froze in the wake of this creature, I understood why now. I wanted to run, I wanted to flee, but I couldn't. It locked eyes with me, but even though it stared me down and knew that I was an easy target, it didn't attack. Instead, it turned to Phil. I screamed for him to run, but he wasn't fast enough. No one was. The flare, with no hesitation, leapt over my best friend as he retreated, landing in front of him and blocking his escape. It grabbed him by the throat, lifting him into the air. As Phil's legs dangled and his feet kicked out haphazardly, the creature raised its blades up to Phil's eyeballs, just literally about to drive its weapons into his skull, as Phil whimpered helplessly. When suddenly the trees shake nearby and out comes Braun, flying from the green, like a brilliant red Superman as he violently tackled the beast. We all watched in awe as they both did several somersaults along the ground, before Braun landed on top of the monstrosity that was this creature, and began to slash and tear at the beast with a pent-up rage and ferocity. His efforts to kill it are stopped in their tracks as he's grabbed firmly around the throat. Through his constricted larynx, Braun let out a choking roar at the beast. Despite the restricted oxygen, Braun defiantly lifted a fist and violently slammed it down on the flare's head with enough force to send the creature nearly a foot deep into the earth. The impact caused the flare to lose his grip on Braun's throat, long enough for Braun to get back on 2 feet and grab the beast by the legs. With a powerful yank, he sweeps the flare onto its back, and Braun musters all the energy, spinning in a 360 motion before releasing his grip, sending the flare hurtling across the clearing and crashing through 3 different tree trunks before finally sliding over a dozen feet across the ground, the earth being dragged up as the beast came to a burning stop. "Everyone, focus your fire on that thing now," came the commander once again, this time his voice more desperate than ever. The bullets rained down on the flare as it rose to its feet, but the flying lead did little more than simply annoy the beast. It turned to face Braun, who was glaring right back at him. The flare scoffs an evil chuckle, as if giving Braun a small show of respect, before cracking its neck into readying itself for round 2. "You're one of Keller's dogs, aren't you?" Braun roared over to it with passionate fury. The flare didn't need a second instance of mockery. It charged at Braun, bent on payback. Braun based himself out, ready for the huge impact the beast would no doubt cause. We all watched with intense anxiety, ready for the 2 titans to clash. I was worried that Braun wouldn't be able to handle the force that this thing was generating, as it charged at a terrifying speed, tearing up the ground with its hooves. I quickly looked around, praying that Arya would be coming to assist, but she was nowhere to be seen. The trees had still parted from where she had crashed. I turned back to Bronn, noticing one of the uprooted tree trunks from the earlier carnage. "Bronn!" I yelled over, grabbing his attention. I pointed to the giant wooden weapon on the ground. Without a second's hesitation, Bronn grabbed the fallen tree by the trunk with both claws, hoisting it up with a grunt, and prepared to use it as a battering ram against the creature. We reloaded in a hasty panic as the two behemoths prepared to collide. Bronn pulled the tree trunk back, swinging for the cheap seats in an attempt to knock the flare right out of the Rockies. But the flare was too quick. His left-bladed limb was aimed well and met the tree with laser precision. The trunk was sliced clean in half, leaving Bronn with two large cylinders of raw wood in each claw. The flare laughed with amusement, as Bronn stared bewildered at the two perfect cuts of wood in his claws. We all looked horrified at the swing of the momentum in the flare's favor. Bronn, clearly thinking on his feet with no waste in motion, spread his arms, lunged forward, and slammed each cylinder of wood on either side of the flare's head. The old oak breaking around the creature's skull as the two trunks connected with a loud thud. Bronn dropped the logs as the flare shook off the head fog and the bark chippings from his skin. Both the beasts roared at one another, pulling back their claws and fists back to attack, but the flare beat Bronn to it, throwing a violent punch at Bronn's chest, sending him back dozens of feet, almost knocking us down like bowling pins as he crashed into the trees on the other side of the clearing. The flare turned to us now, a grim smirk on its face as it saw Bronn hadn't gotten back up. We were there for the taking. "You picked a beautiful hill to die on tonight," the flare groaned, flexing his weapons and sauntering over to us. We were all frozen to the spot. Some began praying, some began frantically reloading. Not that bullets were much use. We all anticipated pain and agony as the thing made its way closer to us. However, the sound of footsteps behind us picking up speed caught our attention. We turned to see the sight of Arya racing through the crowd of soldiers, launching through the air at the flare. She struck at him with her left claw, but the skilled demonic assassin blocked her strike and returned it with a stiff blow of his own, sending Arya back the way that she came, blasting her through a tree and slamming against another. The flare didn't waste any time, and he dashed forward toward her. Arya had just about scrambled to her feet as the flare had reached her, spiking her back against the tree as he drove his hand into her throat. She struggled against his power as her feet dangled off the ground. He raised his left limb, the point of the blade tauntingly dragged across her face, and threatened to slice her snout from her skull. We all fired another rain of bullets into the flare's back, not even a flinch in return. The flare pulled his arm back ready to slice, but Bronn with impeccable timing came barreling from around the tree in which Arya was pinned against, barging the flare and body slamming him through an adjacent oak. The two wrestled on the ground, desperately fighting for dominance. We all stood watching the scrap like anxious cheerleaders, praying Bronn would come out on top. But the flare was able to push Bronn off with his legs. Both leapt to their feet in unison and Bronn lunged forward again, with a second wind and newfound rage. The both of them traded devastating blows that would kill any normal man on impact, and these two monsters were knocking 7 bells out of each other, throwing slashes and slices for good measure. Bronn attempted to slice the jugular of the flare with a vicious slash of his claws. The killer blow, however, was blocked by the flare, who countered by opening its fist and wrapping its fingers around Bronn's head, before seemingly squeezing his cranium with a vice-like grip. Bronn painfully roared as he clearly felt the structure of his skull beginning to compact. He needed to get this thing off. A Hail Mary of an uppercut on the beast resulted in the flare's chin nearly touching the back of his neck, causing its grip to loosen just enough for Bronn to slip out. Bronn wasted no time, grabbing the flare's arm. He flung the creature across the forest to throw it in the direction of an awaiting Arya, who springboarded into the air and slashed the creature en route in a thunderous clothesline maneuver. We all punched the air elated at the great double team, but this thing just wouldn't go down. Bullets at tree trunks and the combined strength of a Wendigo and Braun still hadn't done more than simply knock this thing around. We needed something else, some other way to combat this thing. The flare kicked up its feet and struck its horns into both Braun and Arya, knocking them both over. It leapt into the air, spiraling with majestic grace before landing on Arya, mounting her. With a smile on its face, it raised its left limb above her head and brought the array of blades down with a purposeful fury. All our hearts skipped a beat as Arya managed to evade it in the nick of time, the rusted blades only mere inches from colliding with her face. She lunged at the flare, but she was swatted away like a fly, sending her skidding across the harsh earth. The flare then turned his attention to Braun, who was picking himself up. He quickly slammed his fist down onto Braun's chest, knocking him back to the dirt and pinning him to the ground. Arya, meanwhile, was shaking off the cobwebs and collecting herself. She watched on in horror, we all did, as the flare brought his fist up into the air and slammed it down at Braun's face, driving the back of his head into the ground. Braun struggled to get back up, only to have the fist slammed down in his face again and again and again and again. Braun wasn't moving. We all looked on, mouths agape as we all assumed the worst. The flare lifted his fist up for yet another blow. A satisfied chuckle gurgled up through its throat as it brought down the hammer. But like something out of an action movie, Braun's will to win shone through. He reached up and caught the arm in his claw, growling as he held it, inches from his face with a strained expression. I stood there, cheering Braun to get up, when something came to mind. Dr. Wallace's briefing. The strain of the situation had put it to the back of my memory, but now, the memories of what he had said came to the front of my mind, and I remembered. I remembered why no matter what we did to this thing, it wouldn't go down. And that's because it could only be harmed by one thing: itself. Braun, its own hand. It can only die by its own hand. I shouted as loud as I could, despite knowing that it could hear me from a mile away. Braun shoved the beast's fist upward as he turned away and crawled to the left on all fours, getting distance between him and the flare, before once again getting back to his feet. And that's when what I said to him finally sank in, and he knew exactly what to do. The flare leapt at Braun, attempting to slice Braun in half with its blades. The strike was a powerful one, and the blade connected with Braun's shoulder. It pierced the skin but didn't go deep enough to be a problem, as Braun was once again able to get a hold of the flare's limb with a tight grip with both claws, preventing him from severing his arm. This, however, left Braun unable to defend himself against the other arm. The flare flashed a grin, muttering, "Checkmate," as he pulled back its hulking fist, ready to strike Braun's unprotected face. The blow sliced through the air, breaking the sound barrier, as the powerful strike was inches from connecting, but stopped just before impact. The flare looked to see what had suddenly grabbed his arm. Arya. She screeched in the flare's face as she held back the blow with full strain. The opportunity had presented itself for Braun. He yanked on the creature's limb with an eruptive roar, using every ounce of strength left in him to bend the flare's limb so the blade was aimed right back at the creature itself. Braun dug down probably deeper than he ever had before and lunged forward with all his might, the flare's limb still in his desperate grip. The effort from Braun drove the blade through the flare's eye and deep enough into its skull that it burst out the back of its own head. The satisfying sound of dead flesh tearing, stopping the demonic assassin dead in its tracks. Not a single drop of blood left its mortal wound, but for the first time, there was no sign of it shrugging this wound off with amusement. In fact, the beast didn't even have time to roar or make a sound. It just simply froze. Its skin suddenly started to change texture like that of stone, starting at the head and moving down the rest of its body mass in a matter of seconds. Braun and Arya both took a step back from the monster-turned statue, preparing themselves for the slightest sign of movement that never came. The statue stared back at us, as we observed it with anxious breathing. But after a few seconds passed, we all sighed with relief. Some of the soldiers came running up to Braun, patting him on the back and congratulating him on saving their butts. One young soldier came up to him offering a high five. Braun stared back at him with no emotion or return of the gesture. The guy was just left with his hand awkwardly in the air. Braun was clearly not over his issues with agency personnel. Had I not been stood in a decimated clearing sprayed with blood and other stuff, I probably would have found that amusing. Me, Phil, Farrar, and Jenny approached Arya and Braun, examining their wounds. They looked painful but were thankfully superficial. Braun's had already shown signs of healing up. Meanwhile, Miles and Richard observed their fallen comrades, who had fell victim to the Flayers' ballet of violence. The commander did a quick head count, and after we had all collected ourselves, we moved on. I walked with Braun up the hill as we circled around the peak and came to a break in the trees. We all looked out over the side of the mountain, seeing the small dotted lights of civilization in the distance. They have no idea how close they are, do they? I asked philosophically. Braun turned to look at the lights. No, and if I have my way, they never will, he remarked with purpose. Any sign of the orchestrator? I asked him with curiosity. Braun took one last sniff of the air. He's not here, but he's still alive, he remarked confidently. So what do you think happened? Do you think the Flayer or one of the others abducted him? I inquired. Braun shrugged his shoulders. We'll find out soon enough, he speculated just as Phil walked past. We will, I snapped. We have to stop these things, even if it kills us, I added assuringly, as Braun's confidence wore off on me. We continued up the hill and entered the next section of woodland. We weren't far from our destination now, just about another mile. The herd was thinner now. I counted 13 less bodies that we had to combat whatever came next. We had lost a quarter of our soldiers and one of our cryptids, and there were at least another 3 more of these things to come. And if we didn't hurry, 4. That was quick thinking, James, with the on-hand thing. Jenny complimented me. Phil patted me on the back in agreement. Yeah, kid, good work. I think a lot of us just froze or wasted ammo. I'm glad one of us had a head on us, and thank God you guys agreed to help, 'cause none of us would have been able to grapple with that thing. Farrar added as we walked in the center of the group. Miles and the commander led the line as we pressed on, with the more hesitant soldiers hanging back a little. I couldn't help but think that they would run at the next sign of trouble. I just remembered the doctor's briefing. With an evil force, God would grant some sort of kill switch for these things. The Flayers was dying by its own hand. When I saw Braun gripping its blade in his claws, it just came to mind. I only wish that I would have remembered it sooner. We could have more men and less injuries. You did good, James, Braun assured me. He lifted up his claw. I smiled at him and high-fived him. A small, good-feel moment in an otherwise horrible situation. But the good news is, I remember the briefing now too, and the Flayer was described as the most skilled warrior of the bunch, and Braun and Arya just kicked his freaking butt. Phil pointed out with enthusiasm. We all took the small win and shared his confidence. Actually, they said it was one of the 2 most skilled in combat, I believe, Farrar remarked. The other was the His comment was cut off by the sound of multiple short, sharp, and muffled gasps coming from behind us. We all turned around slowly. Braun mentioned that he had picked up the sudden scent of blood in the air. The soldiers were still behind us, but they weren't walking anymore. In fact, they were slightly stumbling around, mouths closed and eyes wide open. They all brought their hands slowly up to their jaws and gently examined their cheeks with their fingers. We all looked back in confusion. Troopers, what's the matter? The commander yelled over the top of us. I started cocking my head to the side, assessing their behavior, until I heard Bob Farrar mutter the end of his sentence behind me. The dentist. Suddenly, the men all spat off mouthfuls of blood and loose flesh. They retched up the red sticky substance, and when they stood back up to face level, we could see that their entire teeth and gum structures had been torn out before they even knew what was happening. All 6 of the men collapsed in front of us like a row of dominoes. Braun and Arya began frantically scanning their surroundings for the threat. We all began urgently reloading our weapons, ready to defend ourselves against the next insidious force that tried to stop our efforts. We all began to slowly back away from these soldiers who lay on the ground, still twitching in pools of their own claret. Suddenly, Braun began to inhale through his nose and slowly looked upwards. We all followed his gaze as the sound of crunching could be heard above us. In the trees, in a small gap between the leafy shrubs, something could be seen. A murky gray flesh was moving around up there with a collection of long limbs slithering around like jungle pythons. Get ready, Braun growled. We all looked and loaded and aimed into the green while Braun opened a claw, ready to slash whatever came at him. We moved around, trying to get a better vantage point. A larger gap in the trees became clear, and we got a good glimpse of what was up there, and we got our first glimpse of the dentist. It was up there, throwing lumps of blood-stained teeth into its sagging mouth and crunching them like hard candies, with a set of broken, jagged teeth itself. Its eyes were luminous red with pointed black pupils. It relished the taste that it got from the teeth that it had just feasted on, but quickly noticed our eyes fixated on it. It snapped its head to the side to face us. It flashed us a sickly grin, and quickly slithered out of sight into the rest of the green. Everyone began aiming their guns into the green roof of overlapping tree branches above us, everybody spinning on their heels, frantically looking for any sign of movement. As we spun around, sharp yells of panic could be heard, before a rustling in the trees above us. We all turned to the sound, noticing that someone was missing. An identical series of sounds could be heard from the other side of the clearing, so we turned quickly, noticing another soldier wasn't where they were stood a second ago. It's picking us off. Open fire, the commander yelled. We all began raining bullets into the air and blowing the tree branches to smithereens. Cease fire, the commander yelled, holding his hand up to simulate his order. We all lowered our weapons. Did we, get it? One soldier asked, shakily. No, I can hear it, Braun announced. The commander didn't provide a second opinion, instead just keeping his weapon aimed up at the trees and examining the scene above. I thought back to the briefing, remembering that he said there was no secret way to kill this thing. If you got close, you could do it. It was highly plausible that one of the hundreds of bullets that we unleashed clocked this thing in the... My train of thought was halted in its tracks, as 2 soldiers came crashing down out of the trees and hitting the dirt with a dull thud. Their entire jaws had been torn completely off. Their still corpses lay prone on the ground, their chin, teeth, and cheeks missing. The way the remaining top lip and nose just rested on the ground as their twisted, vacant eyes stared up at us, it made our spines shiver. Their blood pooled out from under their gum line as, with nothing to hold it in, their tongues just flopped out haphazardly. The look of what was left of their expressions told us that these men had died in horrific agony, and what killed them leapt out of the trees and landed in the middle of the clearing. The dentist landed on all 8 limbs, with its head hung towards the ground. I examined the beast quickly. Humanoid milky skin that gave the thing an albino look. Its bottom 2 feet looked similar to that of a man, but they were deformed. Very long, and the toenails were more like talons. Its next 2 that seemed to come from its hips were like tentacles. Long white anaconda-like limbs that ended with metal clamp-like claws. The 2 limbs above that were long, slender arms extending its 2 claws, with long fingers and razor-sharp claws. Its final two limbs were another set of clamping tentacles that slithered out of the creature's upper back. It raised its bald, veiny head to look at us, flashing a toothy grin made up of cracked, odd-sized teeth. I couldn't help but wonder if there were teeth he had taken from previous victims. It stood up, supporting itself in the bottom four limbs, its extra-long abdomen arching in a grotesque way like a spider's thorax. The dentist and Braun locked eyes, the knuckles on their claws tightening, their teeth clenching. The dentist got a curious look on his face as he brought the sharp nail of his finger and thumb to his own mouth. He reached into his gullet and began picking at the back of his teeth. After a fiddle around, a clicking sound popped and broke the tense silence. The creature pulled out its hand, with a loose and bloody tooth pinched in its talons. It looked at the small piece of enamel-coated anatomy with sinister giddiness, as it casted a sly look at the broken bodies of the two soldiers, looking like a kid who had just did something naughty, and enjoyed every second of it. He flicked the tooth across the clearing in our direction. The tooth skimmed across the dirt, ricocheting off the ground and hitting Braun on the side of the foot. Before Braun even had a chance to pounce on the creature, the commander made a fatal mistake. Fire! Fire at what? His order was cut off as one of the dentist's clamping limbs snapped his direction. The metal clamp drove into the commander's mouth. His lips made a wide circle around the intruding limb, and the limb thrashed around for a brief second as we all watched on in horror, as blood began spluttering through the small gaps of his lips and the commander's eyes rolled back in his head. And then as quick as it went in, the dentist tore its limb back even quicker. Braun dropped to all fours and quickly lunged at the beast, only to be quickly knocked away by its free tentacle. The whites of the commander's eyes were wide with agony as the skin of his bottom jaw sagged down. He collapsed on the ground. The dentist had the commander's entire jaw, clamped perfectly in its hand. It began giggling and making the row of blood gums and teeth talk like a puppet. "Cease fire! Forward march! Halt!" It quipped in the commander's tone, mockingly before laughing maniacally. Everyone pulled their guns to their shoulders and swarmed this thing with bullets. We only needed one good shot. We hoped anyway. The dentist saw the bullets coming before they even left the barrels. It leapt into the air, contorting around, dodging the incoming lead assault. It landed back on the ground, snapping its limbs around in every direction. Everyone felt their guns slap from their grip and knocked to the ground. A few soldiers made quick moves to retrieve their weapons, but they never got to them. Both men were snatched up by their necks, the clamp slowly crushing their windpipes as they struggled, desperately kicking against the pressure. A couple tried to assist, but the dentist was quick to stop them, spiking out its other two clamp limbs and driving through the torsos of both men, before yanking back and letting their insides spill out onto the ground. Arya began charging at the beast, but she wasn't quick enough to save the two soldiers. We watched as their eyeballs began inflating to horrifying proportions, and their skin turned a ghastly purple. Arya leapt at the creature, only to have the two dead soldiers flung at her like a pair of hacky sacks. Arya charged through the incoming cadavers, but her momentum was checked slightly, just enough for the dentist to reset and swipe Arya's feet out from under her. The dentist leapt into the air, dodging the next wave of gunfire, like something out of the Matrix, swinging his arms around with precision, knocking the remaining weapons from the grips of the soldiers. He came back down to earth with a thud, right on top of Arya just as she was halfway to her feet, pinning each of Arya's 4 limbs down with 4 of his, with one free clamping limb to finish her off. The dentist grinned with insidious intent before raising the tentacle into the air above Arya's head. We all ran to assist, but with one hard swing, the dentist sent us all flying into the trees. 1 or 2 of the soldiers died on impact. They didn't have the strength or skeletal integrity that Braun and Arya possessed, and the firmness of the giant oaks were equal to them being hit by a train. The rest of us landed in a mixture of dirt, bushes, and mud, sitting up from the impact, groaning in pain and breathlessness. I looked to the side, seeing Phil was in pain but was alive. Jenny, on the other hand, wasn't moving at all. I sat up in a panic before looking back into the tree line and spotted Braun quickly moving from tree top to tree top at a nearly unperceivable speed towards the dentist. The only thing giving me an idea of how fast he was moving was the red blur of his body. He suddenly leapt down from the tree, pouncing onto the dentist and tackled him off of Arya in a fit of intense rage, roaring and snarling at the creatures they tumbled and somersaulted around, slamming through various bushes, rocks, and even trees. The dirt was kicked up and thrown around. Braun and the dentist traded blows and slashes at such supernatural speeds that it was nearly impossible to tell who was even winning this cryptid throwdown. But suddenly, they had come to something resembling a stop, and Braun grabs the dentist with a vice grip before throwing him forward, smashing him through the girthy trunk of an oak tree. All the wood violently snaps and it begins to timber, but in a direction that was quite unfortunate. One of the soldiers who had been flung back earlier by the dentist was laying right underneath, where it was projected to impact the ground, and he was still alive, as evidenced by his groaning attempts to get to his feet. I knew that I had to do something, anything that I could. "Look out," I shouted, prompting another soldier to begin sprinting over to grab him. And with an adrenaline-pumping sprint, he cleared the distance. But he wouldn't be able to pull the agent out in time. Not a chance. The trunk continued to fall with both of them now underneath it. A matter of milliseconds left before their inevitable doom came to pass. I closed my eyes, waiting for the brutal impact to occur. But it never came. Instead, all I heard was a deep snarl and groan, along with a string of gasps that told me something very different had taken place. So I opened my eyes, and my mouth going agape at the sight that I saw. There stood Arya next to the previously doomed men, looking at them with her sunken eyes as she supported the fallen tree on her back and held each end in place with her claws. It was truly a spectacle to behold, especially for the men whose lives that she had just saved, seeing a Wendigo basically squatting a tree over their heads. "Move, now!" She snarled at the both of them, gripping the tree trunk with her claws as she slowly raised herself into a taller stance, the weight of it undoubtedly putting a strain on her body. But she managed to get back to her feet, allowing the trunk to roll off her shoulders and fall to the ground with a blaring thud. I turned my attention back to Braun and the dentist, who were still attempting to tear each other to shreds. The dentist had Braun pinned against a tree and reached into his mouth with one of his grotesque limbs in order to try and take one of his teeth, only for Braun to bite down hard on said limb and follow up with a deadly slash of his claws to the beast's body before it had a chance to scream. The resulting slash sent the beast back several feet, allowing enough time for Arya to jump into the mix and pounce on it. She clamped her jaws down on the creature and thrashed him side to side before dragging him back. But this proved to be an error on her part, as the dentist utilized the momentum to throw itself forward and crash into her. They both went tumbling back into the clearing, brutal wrestling with one another before the dentist once again rammed his into Arya with his body weight, this time more purposeful than strategically, sending her back into the tree line just as Braun had come flying out of it, heading to the dentist with a murderous look in his eyes. But the dentist was prepared. He threw out two of his tentacles, wrapping them around Braun's body, stopping his attack en route and pinning him to the ground with enough force to kick up chunks of earth. The beast then quickly threw itself onto him, using his weight combined with his strength to help keep Braun pinned helplessly against the dirt. I ran out into the clearing just as the dentist had clamped Braun's neck and began to squeeze. "Hey!" I yelled at the creature. Its head snapped up to look at me, aiming its focus at me, taking its full attention off of Braun. just enough for him to wiggle his right foot free and push off of the dentist's hip. Braun kicked with all his raw power and sent the dentist back several yards. But this thing was like a cat. It almost never landed on its back. It landed with grace on its limbs and looked at Braun, flashing its sick and twisted grin at him, as if to say, "Nice try." Braun kipped up to his feet, ready for war, and the dentist was too. The eight-legged freak began galloping over to Braun to engage in another war. Braun lowered his hips, ready to absorb the initial impact and counter accordingly. The dentist leaps off the ground, tentacles coiled back ready to clamp, grab, and smash. Braun flexed his claws and fangs ready to cut this thing to ribbons. The collision was inches away, when a large oak trunk came flying from out of the tree line and smashed into the dentist, knocking him across the clearing and into another tree. Braun and I snapped our heads to the side to see Arya standing there panting, after just launching the weighty piece of woodland that, if not for her, would have been coated in the remains of 2 crusted soldiers. The dentist, for the first time, was on its back, but after a grunt of anger it shrugged the tree off with ease. It wasn't grinning this time, it was angry now. The creature launched at me, Braun, and Arya, and we stood together in the clearing. The speed of the creature caught us off guard. It was moments from impact when something stopped its momentum and yanked it back to the ground. We all looked to see what had grabbed the attacking creature, only to see that nobody had pulled it back. One of its tentacles was trapped under the trunk that Arya had thrown at it. We all looked at each other. This joint penny drop moment hit us all like a ton of bricks. We all suddenly knew what to do. Braun leapt at the dentist, and he was still outnumbered limb-wise, 7-2, but he didn't care. Braun leapt into the striking zone, slashing at the creature once again. The dentist, though, blocked every attempt that Braun tried, but Braun showcased his own impressive agility, as he ducked every counterblow, rolling under every return swipe, and catching every desperate stab from the dentist. Arya ran with a rapid pace, smashing through the tree line, looking for more loose broken tree trunks that she could find, looking to find more giant paperweights. I, meanwhile, ran and picked up one of the loose automatic weapons on the ground. I turned to aim the firearm at the creature, but it was too quick. It smashed me into some nearby bushes before I even had the chance to steady the rifle. I laid on my side, nursing my bruised body, watching Braun going all out, toe-to-toe with this thing. After a few more heated exchanges between the two, it managed to knock Braun's feet out from under him with a crafty swipe with its bottom limb. Braun scrambled out of the way before this thing brought a clamp down on his unprotected head, rolling forward to evade the killer blow. But the dentist snapped a limb out of Braun, clamping around his foot as his back was to the creature, flipping him over and dragging him back toward it. Braun kicked and thrashed, but this thing's grip was way too strong. I watched him panic as I struggled against my pain to get back to my feet. Not that I would have been able to do anything. I limped into the clearing, collapsing near one of the loose assault rifles. I reached for it, but it was too far away. The dentist snapped its head toward me, extending a tentacle my way, no doubt likely to rip my jaw off, like the poor commanders, and revel in making Braun watch. But like she was waiting for her perfect chance, Arya leapt from the tree line, half a tree log in her claws. She spiked it down hard on the end of the dentist's clamping limb, just missing Braun's foot. She drove it deep into the hard earth, pinning it in place. The dentist let out a screech in pain that had every conscious person covering their ears. It let go of its grip on Braun and he got back to his feet quickly. Wasting no time, Arya picked up another log that she had spotted, as Braun pounced on one of the dentist's other limbs. He pulled it long and pinned it down to the floor. Arya was ready, as she once again spiked the log into the ground, hammering one of the tentacles like a tent cable. The dentist once again wailed out in agony. Braun leapt on the creature's back, slashing at its head. The dentist slammed its weight back into a nearby tree, attempting to knock Braun off with the impact. Braun held on, however, and continued to slash and bite the creature's flesh. The dentist threw 2 of its free limbs up to defend itself, but Braun was ready, because this is exactly what he wanted the dentist to do. He caught the 2 limbs before they could get a hold of him, quickly crawling around the back of the tree and began forcing the 2 limbs together into a tight knot. Braun frothed at the mouth as he doubled them over, making sure that there was no getting out for this thing. But just as he had yanked the 2 arms to finish the knot, Braun caught a glimpse of what was to the side of him, laying motionless in the nearby bushes. Jenny. She still lay on her side, motionless, as Phil was comforting her, trying to get her to come around. Braun went from being tense with anger to his body language being relaxed with disbelief and shock. His posture and eyes went limp as he saw one of his best friends seriously hurt, maybe even worse. Suddenly, Braun found the dentist's last free limb reaching up and grabbing him by the throat. Due to being focused on Jenny's condition, it caught him completely off guard, and the dentist dragged Braun back into its view, pinning him up against an adjacent tree. The limb was too strong, so Braun couldn't reach the dentist's face to claw back, and the grip was too tight on his neck for him to break it. The dentist used its bottom 2 tentacles, usually reserved for balance rather than combat, and stabbed at Braun's claws, pinning each against the oak. Arya leapt to assist, but the dentist had managed to yank the limb free that was pinned under the initial log, and smashed Arya in midair, sending her crashing through the woodland and landing with a dull thud. I began crawling with everything that I had for the rifle, scrambling across the floor, but it was too far. The dentist had already cocked back his clamp, ready to strike and crush Braun's head like a watermelon. When I leapt forward, grabbing a hold of the gun, I stumbled to my feet and lifted the rifle up to aim and shoot. Braun squinted his eyes and bared his teeth as he prepared for the impact. I pulled the trigger and found that it was stuck. I was too late. The dentist struck. Mere inches from connecting, the clamp halted. Braun slowly opened his eyes, seeing the oncoming tentacle frozen and slowly turning to stone. We all watched as the form of the dentist began to grow the same way, morphing completely in texture to a firm petrified fossil. It went up through all its limbs and torso before finishing at its head, or should I say where its head should be. Braun, still dangling between the oak and stone claw, looked to his left. I followed his gaze and saw Jenny was standing there, hunting rifle still aimed at the creature's broken skull, with smoke rising from the barrel and into the silent night. Arya returned to the scene, quickly striking at the 3 stone limbs that held Braun in place, freeing him from his predicament. Braun dropped to his feet and quickly approached Jenny. "I thought you died," he growled softly. "Oh, you know me, I'm made of strong stuff. I'm not going anywhere anytime soon," Jenny assured Braun, stroking his arm as she caressed her fragile torso. I limped over to Braun. "Are you all right, James?" he asked me with concern. "I'll live," I said with a chuckle. "You risked your life to help me." "Thank you," he professed with genuine appreciation. "Hey, that's what friends do for each other, isn't it?" I replied, offering a high five. Braun smiled warmly and returned the gesture. The power of his high five sent me a step or 2 backwards, with a shooting pain spiking down my ravaged body. We all shared a brief, heartfelt laugh, but the atmosphere had changed. Miles came storming out of the tree line, ordering all these surviving soldiers to get to their feet and to relocate their weapons. "With Commander Dexter, KIA, I am now in command of this operation. We are approximately 3 kilometers away from our destination. We keep moving now," he ordered, picking up his weapon and marching up the trail. We watched as more beaten soldiers came out of the tree line, picked up the nearest firearm, and followed him up the mountain trail. Me and Braun looked at each other with a shared look of contempt for him. "He's quite vexing," Braun remarked. I shook my head. "I second that. But he's right, we need to finish this, come on," I said, flicking my head in the direction of the trail. As we were just setting off, Phil approached Jenny with tentativeness. Ma'am, Jenny, may I call you Jenny? Is that okay, Jenny? Ma'am. Phil rambled like an awkward teen. Jenny scoffed. Jenny's fine, Phil, she said with a chuckle. I just wanted to say that, well, maybe after all this is over. That is, that's if we live, of course. That, Phil continued to stutter and stammer, much to mine and Braun's amusement. Well, spit it out, Jenny said with humored impatience. Well, I just wanted to say I'm glad that you're okay. We need that great shooting of yours. Phil assured her, totally bottling what he really wanted to say. Thanks. Come on, we need to go, Jenny replied, bemused, turning around and walking up the trail with Arya. Phil watched her walk away, seemingly cursing for making a fool of himself. Me and Braun shared an amused look before I turned to Phil. Smooth, real smooth, I teased. Nah, Phil groaned. Come on, let's hurry up and go die now, he remarked facetiously as he walked away. After me and Braun joined the group, Braun leapt into the trees and began racing ahead, likely to make sure that we didn't walk into another ambush. I fell in line with Phil, catching him staring at Jenny as she walked with Arya up ahead. I leaned into his ear. You like her, don't you? I teased. Phil sighed heavily. Son, at first I just thought it was a combination of not being with a woman in over 20 years and my likely imminent death. Of course, but when I saw her got knocked down back there, I felt a real panic. Besides, ain't nothing more attractive than a woman who knows her way around a rifle, Phil said with a nudge and a wink. We shared a light chuckle as Richard fell back and approached us. Hey guys, sorry it's taken a minute, but with the commander and Nick KIA, Miles and I have taken command, and we needed to go over the new mission objectives. So I just wanted to fill you guys in and also make sure that you're both okay, he asked, out of breath with genuine concern. Yeah, we're fine. Sorry, did you say new mission objectives? Phil queried. Richard nodded as I looked at him with curiosity. The bomb technicians who were trying to plant the explosives on the nest. Well, they are among the dead, so we get our opening. Braun is going to take all 4 explosives and find a way of planting them inside the nest. They can be detonated by base camp. So once they're in place and we are at a safe distance, we can detonate them ourselves, Richard explained. Sounds like Miles is just making this up as he goes along, Phil remarked with resentment. With all due respect, Phil, it's called adapting, Richard replied diplomatically. Richard, I said, causing him to turn to me. Braun, the agency created him, right? To destroy other monsters. I just wanted to know where all his assignments, how do I put this? So touch and go, I asked tentatively. Richard sighed. When Braun was created, I was a part of the agency full time. I saw him take down some cryptids in less than a minute. He was our ace in the hole. In fact, I read his file. His creator, Dr. West, noted his overhead press was 30,000 pounds. His sprinting speed was clocked at 80 miles per hour, and his claws could cut through 2 inches of iron. And this was before he was enhanced. If he ever inflicted violence on anything and it survived, it was because he wanted it to. So to see him slashing at these things and they just keep coming, even outmaneuvering him and pinning him to the trees, it tells me one thing, that if these things can do that, then God help us if the Smiler is born. Richard's words were heavy. A tense silence hung in the air as Richard left us and caught back up with Miles. We remained quiet, silently trapped in our heads as we approached the end of the trail. We had reached our destination. The end of the hillside trail opened up into a large, flat clearing of around half a square mile, surrounded by a coliseum of more trees, more hills, and more rocks. If somebody had asked you to draw an ancient ritual site, quite frankly, this would be what you sketched. A large gap in between 2 hill faces acted as a Jurassic Park-style entrance to the eerie setting. The remaining 40 or so soldiers, along with the rest of us, gathered by the walls of the entrance. Miles, myself, and Richard appeared around the corner, hoping to get a look of what was to come without being spotted. As soon as our ears peered over the edge of the rock, they bulged. What can only be described as a giant ant's nest created by thick black webbing had been erected, roughly the height of a 10-story building and the width of around 20 car lengths. If it didn't host the end of the world inside, I would probably find it quite impressive. The spider hybrid creatures from the news clip in my dreams were scuttling in and out of these small gaps and the overlapping webbing, which were spaced all over the surface of the giant cocoon. They were frenzied and worked up. The black-robed priest stood at the foot of the structure, back to us, looking up into the heavens. He held a large book and he was chanting something inaudible into the night. We all looked up at the sky as the clouds began turning dark and ominously formed above the peak of the structure. Thunder was brewing and the mood in the air was malignant. We didn't have much time. "Looks clear, move it and take out the priest." Then Miles' command was cut off by Braun. "No, it's not," he growled, pointing to the back of the cocoon. We all squinted our eyes with Miles using his NV binoculars. "Ah, crap," he muttered. I snatched them from him. "Hey," he snapped in annoyance. I ignored him and placed the lenses against my eyes. Two figures emerged from behind either side of the cocoon, staring right back at me as if they already knew that we were here. Both were bipedal, humanoid but not human. On the left, a small goblin-like creature with pale skin and pointy features. Dead sunken eyes framed its evil grinning face. Its growing area was covered by a pair of black and ragged torn shorts. Its toe and fingernails were brittle and overgrown. The Whistler. On the right was it looked like a nude man had emerged, but this man had no genitalia, no muscle tone, no marks, and no tattoos, no hair, and most of all, no face. It was like a blank canvas. The chameleon. They were both walking in unison, converging in the middle of the clearing, creating the final barrier between us and the cocoon. Dr. Wallace said in his briefing that both of them aren't as physically dangerous as the two that we have already defeated. The chameleon needs to be killed in its original form. I'm guessing that's this. And the Whistler, well, he's gonna whistle a tune that gets in our heads and makes us turn on each other. We've known about this creature for a while, and we've been preparing for this inevitability. Dr. Wallace brought it up earlier, but for those of you who are not familiar with the features of your tactical helmet, there is a black switch on the left-hand side, Miles informed, demonstrating the location of the component. Flick that on my command. It activates the noise-canceling headphones in the helmet. You won't be able to hear anything other than the classical music fed into your ears, but you won't hear the Whistler's tune. What about Braun? I asked, concerned. Mind control is yet to work on me, Braun remarked from above me, still staring forward at the two approaching threats. Okay, well, without that thing being able to control our minds, it's just a case of blowing the thing apart. Easy, Miles speculated. And with the chameleon, I guess that's your job, big guy. Just time it right, he added. Braun didn't look at Miles, still fixed on the other two entities, and he simply nodded. Arya came running back from out of the tree line to rejoin the group. No sign of the orchestrator, she hissed. He's in there somewhere, I can smell him, Braun professed. Well then, let's go find him, Miles ordered, and everybody locked and loaded their weapons and got in formation and began moving in. We all packed together as we passed through the rocky entrance, but fanned out as we had dispersed into the clearing. The priest's chants were getting more intense and his rhythm was reaching a crescendo. The rumbling of thunder grew louder as the clouds above darkened further in color, and the pitter-patter of raindrops began to form on the ground. The chameleon and the Whistler drew closer. We aimed our weapons at them, ready to fire once they came into range. The rain was coming down heavily now and it was clouding our vision, but when they came into clear view, none of us had our minds on our triggers. The Whistler's eyes were glowing a stoplight red as his bare pitching chest sternum heaved with sinister anticipation. The chameleon was still as it was, but we all began watching in morbid fascination as its torso opened up like a zipper full of razor-sharp teeth. The skin peeled back, revealing 4 obscenely long tentacle-like tongues that emerged from a black abyss within its stomach. They both screeched in a frenzied battle cry, causing Miles to scream, "Open fire!" A plethora of bullets were fired towards both creatures. The Whistler flipped and twirled, dodging each and every piece of hot lead that flew at him. The chameleon, on the other hand, didn't move. It simply opened up his torso mouth and let the bullets fly inside, before retracting its tongues and sealing its stomach shut. "What now, Commander?" One of the soldiers whispered to Miles in a nervous and anxious tone. Miles was just about to give his answer when the chameleon caught our attention. We all watched in mesmerization as it began changing in color. It turned dark and took on a cemented, waxy look to it. Its bones began to crack and 4 more limbs began cracking from its torso, which was now forming into 2 sections. The soldiers tried to hold their weapons steady, shaking with fear, wondering what savage beast this thing was going to turn into. It began shrinking and shifting until the end product was nothing more than a large tarantula that was scuttling around on the floor. The soldiers began chuckling with relieved amusement and relaxed their weapons. Miles was one of them. He shook his head and fired at the spider. The bullets tore up the wet earth around it, causing it to scurry around in a panic before burrowing into the ground. The group of soldiers began laughing before turning their attention to the Whistler. "Looks like your pal tuck and ran. Now step aside and let us send you pricks back to the underworld." Miles yelled across the clearing to the creature. It didn't respond though. He just stared back and grinned menacingly. I looked up at Braun, who was in a tree nearby surveying the scene. "Something's not right." "I know," he responded. The Whistler slowly raised its right arm to chest level. The soldiers mirrored him, raising their weapons, but the Whistler didn't fire a gun or cast a spell. It simply began pointing towards the ground. I could feel my heart begin skipping beats as the air that I inhaled into my nose stuttered. An impending sense of dread had now washed over everyone. Braun looked down at the ground, squinting his eyes and concentrating his hearing. A few tense seconds passed before suddenly, his head snapped back and his eyes burst open. "Move!" he yelled in panic. But it was too late. A portion of the clearing's wet surface flipped open like a trapdoor, and out came the spider. But it wasn't a normal size anymore. No, it was the size of a station wagon. It leapt from the fresh burrow and wrapped its huge lunging palps around the closest soldier's waist, and it yanked him back to the ground. Muffled screams of pain and agony could be heard under our feet, before it started to fade out and eventually stopped. Seconds later, a heap of torn flesh, broken bones, and blood-drenched tissue was spat out of the ground, like a whale firing water through its blowhole. We all leapt back, startled, before frantically running for higher ground. I ran toward the tree that Braun was in, as with a minimal effort pulled myself, Phil, Jenny, and Farrar into the safety of it. We looked down at the soldiers frantically running around like headless chickens, some even firing speculative rounds into the ground around their feet. It didn't help though. Every so often the ground would burst open and the giant trapdoor spider, it would leap out and pull another victim into the soil and tear them apart. Meanwhile, Arya raced around doing her best to snatch soldiers from the clutches of death where she could, but even she wasn't quick enough to save everyone. I observed Braun as he lowered his hips as he perched on the end of the branch. His eyes squinted as if he was trying to time whatever he was about to do and just right. Miles and Richard saw us in the tree, deciding that ours was a good plan, and they hurried towards us, as more soldiers were picked off by the oversized arachnid clone. As they dashed towards us, Phil offered his hand to whoever got there first in order to pull them up to safety. We all gasped as Richard tripped and hit the ground with a thud. Miles took one look back over his soldier and decided that he wasn't going to help. Richard closed his eyes and waited for death. Miles clambered onto the branch only to be greeted by my judging glare. "Well, if you aren't going to help him, then I will," I said, starting to climb down until I felt Braun's claw grip my shoulder, preventing me from descending. "Don't worry, nothing will happen to him," Braun growled, still laser focused on the ground by Richard, as he was stumbling to his feet. Braun's hips reached a full dip, just as the ground by Richard exploded open and the spider lunged out to grab him. Richard screamed in terror as the monstrosity reached out for him. Braun launched from the branch and flew towards the creature like a torpedo. The spider had its limbs around Richard's torso, but just before he was torn from his feet and into the ground, the spider was pounced on by Braun, who dug his claws deep into its thorax. The spider squealed in pain as Braun ragged the creature out of its hole, pressing the arachnid above his head in a feat of raw strength. He launched it with his power around 300 yards back into the clearing. The spider struck the ground like a plane crashing into a runway. As it spun and tumbled around the ground, the size and shape of the spider rapidly shifted. With each bounce off the earth, the chameleon shifted from spider to wolf, before changing back to its original form. A few more tumbles saw a giant rattlesnake, a mountain lion, before finally coming to a grinding halt as a grizzly bear. The creature rose on all fours, shaking off the wet dirt, before letting out a bellow of a roar. "This is not a fight you want," Braun snarled at the beast. The two titans began charging at each other. A couple of unfortunate soldiers in the path of the bear were splattered in half by a swift swing of its paw and razor-sharp claws. By the time it was about to lock up with Braun, not only was it covered in blood spatter, but it had gradually grown twice its original size. The two smashed together, wrestling around the clearing, slashing at each other with their claws and sinking their teeth into one another. The bear managed to get a top position on Braun, posturing up in order to bring its teeth down on him with all its weight behind it. As we clambered down from the tree to assist, Arya galloped towards the battle. She leapt towards the bear only for it to swat her away with the back of its hand. We all watched as she hit the dirt hard and skidded along the earth. The blow was far superior in power to the swipe from a regular grizzly bear. Despite people trying to hold me back from getting in between the two brawling giants, I shrugged their attempts off and ran over, gun drawn. The two continued to grapple in a savage brawl on the ground, as I stood there desperately trying to arm my rifle in a way that I would hit the chameleon and miss Braun. It was impossible though, and instead, I just had to wait until the two had separated. But as the two continued to roll around, the more it just looked like one big red blur. Finally, Braun had kicked the chameleon off of him, or at least I thought he did, because it was hard to tell who kicked who off. And when the two separated, I was met with the sight of two identical Brauns staring at one another. The two were just about to re-engage when I fired a warning shot. The two creatures turned to me and I switched my aim from one to the other. "Braun, which one are you?" I asked with a shaky, desperate voice. "James, it's me," the one on the right professed. "Don't listen to this foul beast, James, it is me," the other pleaded. There was a tense silence in the air as there was honestly no way of knowing. A bullet wouldn't kill the chameleon or him, as I could have sworn that he told me he was bulletproof after being enhanced. But I could have been wrong and I didn't want to take that chance. "James, shoot him. We don't have time to waste." The right one pleaded some more. "That's not me, James, don't listen to it," the other one countered. I had my suspicions, but I needed to be sure. I moved closer to them and turned to the one on the right. "Hey, don't worry, bro, it's okay, I know it's you," I assured him, offering my hand out for a handshake. As soon as Braun smiled at me and offered his hand out to return the gesture, I knew that I had chosen correctly. I raised the rifle and quickly and opened fire in the Braun in front of me. The bullets tore through Braun and he squealed in pain, as he stumbled back and fell over its feet, while I and the real Braun watched his mimic rapidly morph into yet another collection of animals and beasts, and once again prepared to pounce. The chameleon eventually morphed back to its base form of the blanked nude man for a brief moment, but that was all that Braun had needed. A brief moment for him to pounce with his claws drawn, driving on the creature and driving his fist into the chest cavity of the shape-shifting entity. It screeched out in agony as Braun delivered the fatal blow. The thing writhed and twitched as we all stood on and watched in horror as Braun stood firm, arm penetrating this thing's body as more creatures began rapidly forming around its arm, until finally it returned to its original form, and we were all relieved to once again see that familiar transformation of a sinister entity to a stone statue take place before our very eyes. Braun ripped his hand from the fossil mannequin and turned to look at me. He chuckled at my quick thinking. "Smart. Very good thinking," he remarked. "Thanks, I thought so too," I responded smugly. The remaining soldiers as well as Miles came to pat me on the back, but our triumph was short-lived. A mix of sounds was coming from the middle of the clearing, and we all turned to see the Whistler. He was standing, arms out in front of him, clapping like a sarcastic child, while laughing maniacally. We turned to face him. Miles stepped toward him defiantly. "Looks like you're a little outnumbered, buddy," he yelled over to him, gesturing towards us, the 30-plus surviving soldiers and Braun. The Whistler didn't flinch, though. He just slowly lowered his arms, pouted his lips, and slowly began to whistle a tune. It began soft and distant, but soon it felt like I was wearing headphones, like the music was instead in my head. I began to not feel like myself. I felt angry, resentful even, and there was a rage building in me. I wanted everyone around me dead. "Flick the switch, boys," Miles commanded, flicking the black switch he had demonstrated earlier. Despite the urges bubbling up through my body, I still had enough of me left to obey Miles' instruction. As soon as that switch was engaged and the soft classic music began to flow into my ears, Beethoven, I believe, it was like I had been injected with Valium. All the hateful thoughts and urges simply washed away. I was me again. "Open fire!" Miles yelled over the top of the music, gesturing so everyone understood what he was commanding. We all raised our guns, ready to fire at the Whistler, but before any of us had pressed the trigger, Braun began sprinting towards the Whistler, ready to tear him limb from limb. "Hold it!" Miles retracted, not wanting any bullets to hit our secret weapon. Besides, we didn't need to shoot him, now that he couldn't infect us with his whimsical tune. As Braun rapidly closed the distance between him and the Whistler, I found it extremely disconcerting that this thing wasn't flinching, not even bracing for impact. In fact, it just kept whistling and grinning, and it wasn't looking at us anymore. It was looking past us. I turned my head slowly to see what the Whistler was looking at, and I froze in terror when I saw Arya, previously on the ground shaking off her war wounds with the chameleon, was now upright, her head twitching side to side, her claws clenched tight. Her sunken eyes were full of hateful rage, but she wasn't looking at the Whistler. She was looking at us. In a moment of horrifying realization, it dawned on me that she was looking for the orchestrator when this topic came up. While Braun is clearly resistant to mind control, it appears that Wendigos are not. Arya, in the blink of an eye, burst from the spot and leapt at the group of soldiers, who didn't even know that she was approaching. They were too busy cheering Braun on as he galloped toward the Whistler, listening to classical music, to even hear her coming up behind them. I screamed to warn them, but I wasn't heard. Braun halted in his tracks as his super hearing picked up on my cries. He turned to see a sight that he was baffled by. Arya tackled one of the soldiers to the ground, sinking her teeth into the back of his neck, and savaging him around until his head broke away from his body. Braun gave the Whistler one last look over his shoulder, wondering if he could get to him before Arya did any more damage. He probably could, but when he looked back to see these soldiers who weren't being attacked, loading and aiming their weapon at her, he knew that he didn't have time. Braun spun on his heels and sprinted on all fours with everything that he had towards us, the Whistler cackling in the background at him as he did. Arya tore her way through 5 soldiers before Braun got to us. "Open fire! Fire at the Wendigo, she's one of them!" Miles ordered, pointing toward her as she began to lower her hips and drag her antlers across the earth, ready to charge once again. This time it was Phil and Jenny who were her target. The soldiers gently squeezed their triggers, ready to blow her away, until a whoosh of red had swiped past our vision. Braun landed in front of the soldiers, swiping and kicking the rifles from their hands, much to their dismay. To them, with all the music polluting their judgment, he was also turning on them, when in fact he was just trying to save his friend. Braun turned to Arya, who was already mid-flight. She tackled him hard to the ground and began trying to snap her jaws across his face like a rabid dog. Braun was preventing her by holding her neck and extending her away from striking distance. I watched Braun, the same Braun who went toe-to-toe and had killed the Flayer, Braun who had tied the dentist in knots, Braun who had just wrestled and tore the heart out of a 20-foot grizzly bear. I watched him flat on his back, just holding the rabbit Arya in his claw. He could have broken her in half, but he didn't. He lay there, his emotions bubbling to the surface, and he became visibly distraught. He narrowed his eyes, a heartbroken expression plastered on his face. "Arya, stop. Don't listen to it. Listen to me, it's Braun, your friend," he pleaded, his begging becoming more and more intense, as it became clear he was going to have to do what the Whistler was likely wanting him to. The Whistler took a break from laughing at the 2 friends locked in combat to begin his whistling once again, making it faster and more intense, like an orchestrator at an opera reaching its crescendo. Arya began thrashing harder, her snapping jaws getting ever closer to Braun's face as her rage intensified. Her antlers began to press into his skin, and although they didn't seem to pierce it, it didn't look like it felt great either. She swung her free claws at him, the tips of her talons just missing his chest by mere millimeters. The Whistler kept up his tune, growing louder and faster, now even doing a childish dance and clapping his hands. Braun shoved her back, pinning her up against a tree as she continued in her efforts to viciously attack him. Arya snarled and lashed, but it was no use against who she was attacking. But the moment that Braun let her go, she would tear us all to shreds. Arya had managed to get her claws free and to lunge them forward at Braun, her palm slamming against his eyes as she tried to grab him around the head. Braun retaliated by throwing his body forward and sending her crashing through the very tree that she was pinned against, as well as another. Arya slid across the earth, kicking up dirt and rock in her wake, but she soon recovered, snarling as she slowly picked herself back up and refocused her attention at Braun, who simply stared at her with a remorseful look. "I will not kill you, but I won't let you kill them either. You need to fight this, Arya," Braun called out to her just as she snapped her jaws open for a spiteful roar. We watched as the Wendigo leapt and stampeded toward Braun, her antlers tearing up tree branches as she closed the distance. Braun didn't move a muscle, instead standing there, still as a statue as she charged at him with a murderous expression. Once the gap had been closed, Arya threw herself at Braun, but the attack was in vain, as Braun had then sidestepped and used her own weight against her, pinning her down on the ground as she continued to thrash, swipe and bite at him to no avail. It was like watching a father restrain his out-of-control child. All of us kept our weapons trained on the Whistler while watching this all transpire in shock and horror. While Arya was a powerful and dangerous being, she was no match for Braun, but that wasn't the point. "Arya, I know that you're in there, this isn't you," Braun went on, desperate to revive the mind of his friend. But it seemed to be almost futile. The rest of us didn't even know what to do, even I with everything that I had seen thus far. didn't know how to truly process what was happening in front of me. However, the look changed in Braun's eyes. It was a look that I hadn't seen him display before, not quite. A combination of both desperation and passion. And all I could imagine is what he was thinking. What sort of emotion or turmoil was circulating through his brain. But instead, when he spoke, it was the softest tone that I had ever heard leave his mouth. And that was something that really shocked me, even more than what he actually said. "Arya, stop. I love you," he announced. There seemed to be a hint of hesitance in Arya for just a moment, like what Braun had just said had gotten to her and passed the Whistler's effect. But it still wasn't enough. So once we all came to our senses, we all knew what we needed to do. All of us turned our heads to look at each other and then straight forward at our target, just before Miles made the announcement, one that we had waited on for far too long at this point. "Open fire on that thing now," he asserted with one heck of a yell. And we did exactly that, obliterating the Whistler in a bullet storm. His agility was ungodly, dodging over 200 bullets, but we had emptied our magazines on that thing. The gunfire eventually started ripping both him and everything in his immediate surrounding to shreds. We gave him everything that we got, and we wouldn't stop until he was nothing but a busted-up statue of stone on the ground. Arya's frantic and feral movement ceased, just as Braun had repeated what he had said moments earlier. And this time when Arya hesitated, she didn't return to her murderous rage. Instead, she just continued to look a bit of distraught Braun, as if having trouble comprehending what she had just heard. There was a wide range of emotions flowing throughout the rest of the group, especially once we saw Braun lift himself off Arya and offer her a claw to get back up. And she took it, getting back up to her feet and throwing herself at Braun not for an attack but a hug. They wrapped their large limbs around each other, Braun soon relaxing as he knew that he no longer had to combat his friend, and Arya expressed a great remorse, seemingly horrified when she had turned to see the result of what the Whistler's influence had done. "I did this," she said, only to be swiftly cut off by Braun. "No, that wasn't you, and it never will be again," he said, glancing at her with a firm but concerned look. "Turn the switch off," Miles yelled, demonstrating what he had wanted us to do. The music stopped and we were once again greeted by the sound of heavy rain, distant chanting, and the sound of spiders scuttling and screeching from inside the cocoon. We raced over to Braun and I cautiously placed my hand on his back, attempting to comfort both him and Arya with my presence. "Don't blame yourself," Jenny approached. "We couldn't have gotten this far without ya. Wasn't your fault. And we still got a mission to finish. Now how about we stand our ground together and keep watch for them, and kill anything that gets too close. We need to make sure they're able to plant those charges." Arya looked down at Jenny, still seemingly in a state of sorrow, but she nodded, agreeing that with everything that had happened, we still needed to complete the objective. "We need to finish this now," Braun professed, almost reading my mind, slowly walking toward the cocoon with the remaining agents. Braun marched up to Miles and locked eyes with him. "You have proven yourself to be competent, and while I would never truly agree with many of your methods, I want to help you put an end to Edward Dean Keller once and for all. So what shall I do?" Miles handed Braun a black metal case. Inside are the 4 packs of C4 that were originally planned for the 4 exterior walls of the cocoon. But now we need you to climb in it, stuff that case in one of those gaps, and then we need you to get some cover fast. We'll take the priest into custody. Okay, team, let's move." Braun began galloping toward the cocoon with all of us in tow. As we reached the cocoon, it became clear this thing was throbbing, pulsating and expanding with each second. We didn't have much time. As we got closer to the priest, Braun was ready to make his climb until it was clear that something out of sight had caught his attention. I started to walk over to see what it was, as these soldiers had raised their weapons at the priest who was finishing his chant. "And now come forth from the earth, our one true ruler, In your new form, your purest form, your true form, please accept our offer of strong blood and grace, the believers with your birth. Sir, place the book on the ground and step away from the cocoon for your own safety. Not that you deserve it. Step backward to us so you can be detained. I heard Miles yell. Oh, it doesn't matter, it's too late, I've done my part. The priest responded as he complied with his orders. There was something about his tone that didn't sit well with me. It wasn't the tone of a man who was pleased with what he had done and was bragging. It was the tone of a man with regret, wishing that we had gotten there sooner. I turned the corner of the cocoon to see Braun arched over something large and green on the ground. I took a few steps forward to discover. It was the orchestrator. Braun was gnawing at the thick ropes that confined him as he lay on the ground. Braun was right. He was alive. What happened to you? Braun asked him. Dear boy and the octopus man knocked me out, tied me up, and the other two brought me back here. They informed me they needed the blood of something powerful to finish the ritual. They were going to use mine, my blood. Thank all the gods that you got here, the orchestrator professed, as Braun continued to tear away at the ropes, eventually freeing him. There was something that didn't add up. Clearly, having seen what was going to be unleashed and how unpredictable and uncontrollable it was, a large part of the priest didn't want this ritual to be completed. But if they were going to use the orchestrator's cryptid blood to finish off the ritual, but all the other entities had been defeated and the priest was in the process of being copped, why was the priest so disheartened? Braun helped the orchestrator to his feet, the two seemingly putting whatever differences they had aside. I need to place these explosives down and then we can retreat, he marked, turning away from the lizard to make his way to the cocoon. The orchestrator began following, and just moments later, that's when I saw it. It glistened when it hit the moonlight. The swipe of light down its metal shape told me everything about what it was. A dagger. Miles, Phil, and the rest came running around the corner in a panic. Braun! They warned loudly. Braun turned to look at them puzzled, as the orchestrator snuck up behind him. Braun followed our eyes to what we were looking at. As soon as he did, and locked eyes with the orchestrator, the sly lizard plunged the blade into Braun's stomach, lunging toward him with such force that their eyes almost touched. You think we're friends? I am your prisoner, he growled as Braun clutched at the blade, stopping it from going any further. I let you come with us, Braun stammered and snarled through the pain. We all watched wide-eyed as the red pigmentation in Braun's skin, it drained from it slowly, being replaced by a dark midnight blue, reverting him back to his appearance in the photos that Miles had shown me. This knife, it was made in the Annihilation Realm, designed to reverse any ritualistic force. Don't worry, this won't kill you, but say farewell to being superior, Braun. I've kept this ever since you took everything from me, just waiting for the right time to bring you down a peg. But after we got word these things were going to destroy us all, I decided that you were more use to me alive, but after these creatures informed me they needed blood of our kind to finish their ritual, I told them that I would give them theirs in trade for a place at their side. And they accepted, he ranted, growling as he did. His eyes bulging as all those months of resentment came out of him. Did you truly think I would give up after one simple defeat, especially to the likes of you, a nobody in the grand scheme of the cosmos, a mere beast from Earth that no one of importance has ever heard of, nor cares for? But since you took my world from me, I will take yours from you. The orchestrator seethed, and he forced the knife further into Braun's gut, causing another pain to snarl from the big guy. After all Braun's red color had faded and been replaced, the orchestrator tore the knife back and Braun dropped to his knees, nursing his wound. A pool of blood, just as blue as his freshly transformed skin and dripping from his wound and fingernails. I had seen the big guy shrug off a lot in a short time that I knew him, but this was no ordinary wound. He was quite literally being weakened with every passing moment, reverting back to the level of power that he had possessed previously. Miles and the soldiers aimed their weapons at the orchestrator as he stepped towards them with the dagger. "Don't move, drop the weapon or we'll shoot," Miles demanded. "Shoot him now, you fools," Braun roared with a painful groan. "He's too dangerous to be left standing." And he was right. The orchestrator grinned as he examined the blade soaked in Braun's blood. He held the knife out as if he was handing it over. One of the soldiers cautiously stepped forward to retrieve it, his weapon still trained on the orchestrator. But just before he had handed it over, he tightened his grip on the handle and stabbed the blade into the wall of the cocoon. A large screech could be heard from within, and the cocoon began to pulsate and throb harder and harder, like a balloon filling with air, and soon it was going to burst. The orchestrator laughed with malice as we all turned our attention to the cocoon. The clouds began circling around the tip of the cocoon, rumbling with intense thunder, until our worst nightmare came true and a fork of lightning cracked from the black clouds and drove its way into the top of the cocoon, blowing open the roof of the nest. As soon as it happened, the rain stopped and the clouds dispersed, and there was a deafening silence that came over the clearing. We all backed up away from the cocoon, out of a combination of wanting a better view and impending dread. I held Braun in my arms as he got over the shock from his attack. We all began to hear movement from within the cocoon. It was big, really big. I was praying the big guy would heal up fast enough to be able to fight. The soldiers squinted their eyes as they examined the top of the cocoon. Suddenly, their eyes bulged and they screamed, "Oh crap!" A loud screeching roar bellowed from the top of the cocoon, and a large black limb the size of a crane protruded from the hole and crashed into the earth. We all watched in horror as 7 more giant spider-like legs came out of the cocoon and broke the earth as they found their feet. The legs extended, the cocoon walls began to crack and break, before this thing thrusted its legs upwards, and the rest of it had exploded out of the cocoon. We looked up in abject terror at the Smiler, an 80-foot-tall black tarantula-like abomination. Its head was humanoid, huge yellow eyes with blood-red pupils and a painfully wide smile that never faded. Large shard-like eyes filled its huge mouth, and a mysterious black mist exuded from every inch of its body. As well as its 8 legs, it had 2 long arms ending in razor-sharp talons where a spider's palps would be. The soldiers fled, except for one who was frozen in terror. The Smiler reached down and snatched him from the ground, lifted him kicking and screaming to its mouth. It began giggling in a frenzy, causing the soldier to scream for mercy, but this was cut off sharply by it lunging forward and tearing the man in half with one bite. "Open fire!" Miles yelled in terror as he raised his weapon. A shower of bullets flew up at the creature. The mist coming off of its body simply swallowed them up, and the Smiler didn't even flinch. Instead, it just laughed, raising one of its front legs. A group of soldiers screamed but didn't move, frozen with fear. Their screams rang through the clearing until they were silenced and replaced with the sound of bones snapping and the Smiler's leg slamming into the earth. Miles, Richard, and the remaining soldiers continued to fire speculative rounds at the monster, but once again it paid them no notice. Its gurgling laugh bubbled up through its throat once again, before inhaling a deep breath and spitting a deep black fog out into the clearing. The black fog split into 4 clouds before shooting into 4 different directions. We watched in horror as 2 shot back down the trail, and the other 2 shot out to these statues of the chameleon and the whistler. "Oh no," I muttered. The fog penetrated the stone figures, and we watched in panic as the rock started to shake and vibrate before eventually exploding open. The whistler and the chameleon leapt to their feet and stared at us. A screech and a roar came from the trail, and seconds later, the flayer and the dentist came leaping through the tree line and landed in line with the other 2 demonic entities. They had flanked around, not even bothering with an encounter with Arya and Jenny, and the group who had stayed behind to stand guard, but I was sure they would be here soon enough. They all now stood with that same mysterious black mist dripping from their bodies. The soldiers turned to face them, weapons shaking with terror. The Smiler lifted one of his arms and snapped its fingers, and the massacre was underway. Men were flayed alive. Men had their jaws ripped from their faces. Men were set upon by a number of vicious, oversized beasts. Men turned aggressive violence on their comrades, and there was nothing that they could do about it. Braun clambered to his feet. "Whoa, what are you doing? You're hurt," I cried with concern. "I'll be fine, but if I don't do something, we won't be," he remarked defiantly. I began galloping up the cocoon and heading toward the Smiler. Braun pushed his pain down and built up steam. He leapt from the webbed mass and aimed his claws for the Smiler. The creature snapped his head towards Braun mid-flight and simply smashed him with its arm, sending him crashing back first into the cocoon, like he was nothing. Braun hit the ground hard, much to the orchestrator's amusement. "Aha, not so tough now, are you?" he taunted as the Smiler stepped its gigantic form over the wounded Braun, lifting its leg and threatening to crush him like a bug. But it didn't instead. It just grunted. "Do easy. You shall suffer a much slower death." It croaked before it began inhaling once again, like it was regurgitating something in its mouth. It lowered its mouth toward Braun, who was stumbling back to his feet to fight. The Smiler roared at Braun, spilling a pitch-black mist on him that quickly found its way into every orifice on his body. Braun held his head in pain before eventually collapsing on the floor and closing his eyes. Myself, Farrar, and Phil ran over to him, holding him in our arms as the Smiler began to walk away. "The others shall finish you all. I have a world to cleanse," it growled as it headed towards the trail. After the coast was clear, Jenny came racing over from the far tree line along with Arya, both of them standing over him with great concern. Braun, what's wrong with him?" Arya demanded to know, the heartbreak evident in her tone. Phil shook his head. "We don't know, he's breathing, but we can't wake him up." "Holy crap, look," I gasped, pointing at a slash that just tore across Braun's chest as he lay there convulsing. A few moments later, another tore across his neck, before another one went across his face. "Something's killing him!" Jenny screamed helplessly. Phil quickly grabbed and embraced her. Arya turned to look at the Smiler with rageful eyes. The Smiler just grinned, sinister. Arya roared, psyching herself up to kill the thing that was hurting Braun. She lowered her antlers and began tearing up the ground as she pelted towards it. "Arya, no!" Jenny screamed with panic, but Arya didn't listen. She was bent on saving Braun. She got within 10 meters of one of its humongous legs before the Smiler simply pulled it back and swung it forward, penalty kicking Arya with so much force that she flew 300 yards without even touching the floor. She crashed through a bunch of trees which caved in on her after she fell to the ground. We all held our breath, waiting for her to get up, but she never did. As we all looked down in horror at the motionless pile of broken trees, fearing the worst, the orchestrator shamelessly walked up to us and looked up at the Smiler. "Hey, you owe me a debt. I want what you promised to me. I want to go back to my home." He yelled up at the Smiler impatiently. "You were promised that as long as you proved you were useful. Now you have outlived said usefulness." It cackled with a deep gurgle, before inhaling and spitting out another batch of fog, this one a mixture of blood red and oil black. It made its way towards the orchestrator, who was now just getting the inkling that he had backed the wrong horse. The mist descended upon him like a swarm of angry bees, engulfing him completely. He let out a groan of searing agony as the mist did its job. We watched as his scales began to melt away. His eyeballs burst in their sockets before dripping down his chest. His blood boiled and exploded in his veins, bursting through his muscles and tendons, until they started to bubble away too. Soon it was just a skeletal frame left, and that began to turn to dust and it blew away in the wind. The Smiler, satisfied with his work, turned away and continued his exit, making sure to aim one of its legs over the priest. Another one who's outlived his purpose. He grunted as the gigantic leg came hurtling down towards the detained priest, a look of almost acceptance on his face, like he was actually grateful that he didn't have to live in this new world that he had helped create. We locked eyes for a moment. The time must give themselves to God. His soft words to me were cut short as the leg came down, driving the priest into the wet earth. As the leg retracted back into the air, remnants of the crushed body of the priest that were splattered to the foot of the Smiler, they began to peel off and fall to the ground like pieces of roadkill from the tire of a truck. Miles came running over to us, frantically packing another magazine into his gun. I looked up at him, caked in the remains of his comrades. Splattered blood on his face and torn pieces of flesh hung from his helmet and rifle. Get him on his feet, we're getting slaughtered out here. Miles yelled, a traumatized madness in his eyes. We can't, it's done something to him, I explained shakily. If that thing leaves this forest, then the whole world ends. Do you hear me? Miles ranted, grabbing my collar and shaking me in desperation. Farrar stood up, trying to separate me and Miles. Hey, come on, settle down, Farrar exclaimed. Braun's hurt and so is Arya. They've saved our butts enough times on this hill. It's time for us to repay the gesture, he professed, cocking his shotgun. Miles stared back at him completely dead-eyed. I couldn't agree more. I didn't want it to come to this, but it looks like we have no other choice, he said apathetically. The sheriff nodded with agreement, not sensing the dark undertone in Miles' remark. Miles raised his rifle and aimed it at Sheriff Farrar, and shot him point blank in the chest. What the? A voice came from behind Miles as an equally covered Richard came running over after seeing his oldest friend clutching a fatal wound in his chest. What are you doing? We all yelled, directing our confused fury at Miles. Ask him, he knows, Miles remarked, that dead vacant tone still in his voice as he gestured towards me. What are you talking about? I responded with bafflement, as Sheriff Farrar continued to bleed out in Richard's arms, and he choked on his own blood. I heard you talking to Dr. Wallace. I heard him to beg you to think about your vision, because you would have seen this anchor to the real world. You said you didn't see anything, but you did. One Keller was chased into the hands of the black-robed people. Who led that chase? Who kicked down those doors to the meat factory to arrest him? Whose voice did you hear in that vision? That's right. Wolf-Lake Sheriff Robert Farrar. You're delusional. There's no way that we can know that. I snapped back at Miles, all that hate from the incident with the Allen family rising into my voice. Well, hurry up and die, Sheriff, so we can find out. Miles raged back at me, glancing down at Farrar. Bob coughed and sputtered for a few seconds before going limp in Richard's arms. Miles grinned, before excitedly looking over at the Smiler who was still exiting the clearing. We all waited, but nothing happened, not even a twitch. Miles' grin slipped and he began to shake his head in frantic disbelief. No, he exclaimed, throwing his rifle to the ground. We're dead. We're all dead. I ran up to grab him, ready to give him what he deserved, when suddenly, 4 large thuds crashed into the earth beside us, and we turned to look. The Flayer, the Dentist, the Chameleon, and the Whistler all stood, staring at us with malign smiles on their faces. Soaked in blood, with a massacre of ripped-up soldiers scattered all over the clearing behind them. Your turn. The Dentist giggled and exclaimed with maniacal excitement. We all stared in horror and fear as they took a step forward. Miles glanced at me, before pushing me hard into the path of the 4 abominations. I stumbled and dropped to my knees as they closed in. Miles, on the other hand, dived to collect his rifle while they were distracted. My eyes were closed, reverting back to that childhood mentality of, if I can't see, they can't see me. But as I heard them walk past, without even so much as grazing me, I couldn't help but wonder if it had worked. I opened my eyes, watching the 4 creatures approach Miles, who scrambled to his feet and fumbled his rifle in panic. I watched them circle and surround him, giggling and laughing as he crumbled to his knees in pure and utter fear. He whimpered and pleaded for mercy, but they didn't give it. We all watched and listened to him being flayed, ripped, torn, and pulled apart. They inflicted so much pain on him that it was hard to watch no matter what our thoughts were on him. The 4 creatures backed off the now destroyed remains of Miles Black and turned their attention to Phil, Jenny, and Richard. They began slowly moving in, each step deliberate. They were savoring the fear, relishing the attack. Richard fired off some rounds as Phil and Jenny had embraced. The bullets were quickly swallowed up by that black mist that exuded from the creatures' bodies, but Richard emptied his magazine anyway. Until the gun had started to click and Richard threw it to the ground with tears in his eyes. "No, stop. Please don't hurt them," I yelled naively, extending my hand in a gesture of desperation. The tears formed in my eyes as the creatures prepared to destroy the humans in front of them, and there was nothing that I could do about it. Or could I? That's the thought that raced through my head as, extending my arm out once again, it revealed the scars on my forearm. A race of flashbacks came through my mind. First was Dr. Wallace screaming, "You must have seen something in that dream. Something Keller didn't want you to see. That's why he wanted to take you out." The next was my conversation in the cabin with Braun. It was like he wanted to kill me in his world so I couldn't hurt him in mine. The third being the priest just before he was crushed. The Thai must give himself to God. And the final flash was of my father, as we had gathered around the casket at my brother's funeral. "No worries, son, he's not in pain anymore. He gave himself back to God." And all of a sudden it made complete sense why those things didn't kill me. I am Keller's tie to the real world. Without thinking too much of the consequences, I dove for the rifle that Miles had dropped, grabbing it with both hands and standing up straight. My breathing became heavy and ragged as I raised the barrel of the weapon and pressed it against the skin under my chin. The creatures lunged to tear into Richard, Phil, and Jenny until I called out to them, "Hey!" The 4 creatures turn around with grins on their faces. When they see what I'm doing, their faces drop and their eyes bulge. The reaction told me everything that I needed to know, and the gravity of it all finally hits home. "James, no!" Phil screams. "You've been like a father to me, Phil. I love you." I yell back at him. I look over at Braun, still clearly in pain as he lays in an unconscious state. I turn back to Jenny and Phil with a tear in my eye. "Tell Braun to finish him," I exclaim confidently. "Stop him," the Flayer yells, commanding the quad of creatures. They dive towards me with urgency. The next few seconds go by in slow motion as I realize it's true what they said about death. All the memories of the past year begin to flash back in my head. All the memories and bonds that I've created here as a ranger of Wolf Lake National Park. It's truly been one heck of a ride. But now it's over, and I'm at peace with that. I mean, come on. One man dies and the whole world lives. Fair trade if you ask me. I think about my family and smile, knowing that I'll be seeing them very soon.